Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of plagues, punishments, and pottage. We're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry Hollywood sold you. The truth? You probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Welcome to the nightmare. Let your eyes close. Let your mind drift back, not to a peaceful dreamscape, but to the waking nightmare that was life in medieval England. Not the romantic fantasy you've seen in films with candlelit banquets and gallant knights, but the version with rotting floors, back-breaking labor, and streets that smell like open wounds. This is the truth behind the tapestry. A world so difficult and so unforgiving that surviving one day might just be a miracle. The first thing you notice isn't the noise or the grayness or even the grime, it's the cold. It seeps through your skin like a whisper and never lets go. There's no central heating here, no insulation in your little cottage of crumbling wattle and daub. The fire in the hearth, if your family is lucky enough to have one, is too weak to do much but push smoke around the single, windowless room. That smoke coats the inside of your nose, your clothes, your lungs. You smell like smoke. Everyone does. Mixed with earth, mixed with sweat, mixed with the scent of humanity surviving in filth. And don't look to the sky for comfort. The clouds press down low, casting the world in a kind of permanent gray. It's muddy even in summer. Puddles gather in the center of the road, which isn't paved. It's just trampled earth turned to muck. When it rains, it floods. When it freezes, the mud becomes rutted ice that can twist an ankle or worse. Every journey, no matter how short, is a gamble. The village itself is little more than a cluster of hovels arranged around a church. That church is the tallest structure by far, and its bell rings out over your day like the tolling of a master's whip. Work begins when the sun rises. Work ends when the sun sets. And in between, you toil. If you are a man, that likely means working the Lord's land. Bending, pulling, digging, sowing, harvesting, hauling. Day in and day out. You're not paid in coin. You're not free to leave. You belong here like the ox, like the tools, like the soil itself. If you're a woman, your work begins earlier. Before dawn, you're up baking bread if you've any flour left, fetching water, tending the fire, caring for children, preserving food, making cloth, brewing ale, mending, cleaning, surviving. And no matter how many children you bear, you know most of them will not live. Half of them may be gone before their 5th birthday. Don't mistake the quiet for peace. It's the quiet of exhaustion. Most people you meet have a haunted look, not out of fear, but from sheer fatigue. Hunger is always nearby. Winter brings starvation. Spring brings mud and disease. Summer brings labor. Autumn brings taxes. There is never a good season. And forget the notion of privacy. You live in a one-room shack with your family, possibly with livestock. You sleep on straw, maybe covered in fleas. Clothes are few, often shared, never washed. Your daily toilet is a bucket or the bushes or a cesspit. You empty it into the street, just like everyone else. Your neighbor there is tired and poor as you, but that doesn't mean you trust them. Theft is common, gossip is dangerous. If someone accuses you of something, say, stealing grain or practicing witchcraft, you may find yourself facing trial by ordeal. That could mean holding a hot iron to prove your innocence. If the wound heals clean, God has vindicated you. If it festers, well, you were guilty anyway. Justice is not blind, it's brutal and fast. Stocks, whipping, branding, hanging. If you break a law even by accident, you could pay with your body or your life. The law isn't there to protect you. It's there to protect the powerful from you. Speaking of the powerful, you'll rarely see them. The lord in his manor, the knight in his armor, the merchant in his boots, they exist far above you. You might catch a glimpse on holy days when the whole village is forced to attend church. That church, with its stone walls and crucifix hanging overhead, offers one promise: suffer now and heaven awaits. But it is also a place of fear. The priest watches, reports, judges. The church owns your soul and your land and often your labor. So what about food? What's on the table for dinner in medieval England? Likely a small bowl of pottage, a thick grayish stew of boiled grains, root vegetables, and water. Maybe there's some stale bread. If you're lucky, you've saved a piece of cheese from earlier in the week. Meat is rare. Eggs, rarer still. Ale is safer than water, so you drink that, but it's weak and flat, brewed in batches, just strong enough to kill the germs in the water, not strong enough to make you forget where you are. Health, don't expect much. Medicine is a mix of herbs, prayers, and bleeding. If you get a toothache, it could kill you. If you break a bone, you're crippled. If you get a fever, it might be the plague. And when the plague comes, as it did again and again in waves, it doesn't just kill, it empties villages. Entire families wiped out in days, buried in shallow pits. No doctors, no treatment, just prayers and fire. And still, despite it all, you must go on. You must work. You must survive. Because to live even one day in medieval England is an act of endurance. It is suffering without explanation, struggle without reward, faith without mercy. A place where your life can end at any moment and be forgotten just as quickly. The myths paint it as a land of chivalry, honor, romance, but the truth is darker, colder, and infinitely more exhausting. And so, as your eyes grow heavier, remember this. You are safe now. You are not in that hut. You are not barefoot in the mud. You are not waking before dawn to serve a master who will never know your name. You're in a bed, with a blanket, and clean water, and safety, and warmth. Sleep well. You earned it, especially knowing you wouldn't have lasted one full day in medieval England. The Black Death arrives, plague, panic, and piles of bodies. How the plague devastated the population and why it was nearly impossible to survive. The year is 1347. The world you knew just moments ago now feels different. Thinner, colder, darker. The Black Death, a terrifying wave of bubonic plague, has arrived in England, carried by fleas, hitching rides on black rats aboard merchant ships that dock at ports along the coast. And once it starts, it spreads faster than wildfire in a dry forest, sparing no one. Imagine a quiet village. The air hangs heavy with the scent of decay and despair. People are coughing, sweating, and breaking out in strange, painful swellings called buboes, large, dark lumps that appear under the armpits, neck, and groin. They are the plague's signature, its cruel calling card. Within days, those infected grow weak and delirious. Fevers spike, skin turns mottled, and many fall into unconsciousness. Death follows swiftly, often within a week. There are no doctors who understand this disease, no medicines that help, only superstition and prayers. Clergy rush to offer last rites, but even their presence can't calm the mounting panic. People do what they can. Some flee the towns, desperate to escape the invisible enemy. Others lock themselves inside their homes, hoping the walls will keep death at bay. But the plague does not care for walls or prayers. Fleas jump to new hosts. Rats scurry through alleys and markets, spreading the infection further. Whole families vanish. Fathers, mothers, children, gone. Fields lie untended. Shops close. Markets empty. The social order crumbles like dry stone walls. Villages become ghost towns overnight. Mass graves are dug in hurried pits on the outskirts, bodies piled one atop another. There's no time or space for proper burials. Fear twists people's minds. Some blame strangers, others blame neighbors. Jewish communities become scapegoats and suffer brutal persecution. It's a time when reason falters and suspicion flourishes. But even beyond the terror, life continues for those who survive. Food becomes scarce as farmhands perish. The economy sputters. Wages rise briefly because there are fewer workers, but lords tighten control, demanding taxes and rents from desperate peasants who have lost everything. And yet, there is a strange, grim resilience. Some villages recover. New families grow. Over decades, England's population slowly returns, but the scars of the Black Death remain, a reminder that in medieval times, survival was never guaranteed. Death was always just a breath away. So now, as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the heavy silence of abandoned villages, the creeping fear in the eyes of those left behind, and the endless night that once gripped medieval England. Rest easy. You have escaped the plague, if only for tonight. The year is 1347, a time when life was already hard enough for most in medieval England, a time when food was scarce, medicine was primitive, and every day brought new struggles. Yet, nothing could have prepared the people for the dark shadow that was about to fall over their world. This shadow had a name that would be whispered in dread for centuries to come: the Black Death. It began far away in the bustling trading ports of Asia, carried unknowingly by ships laden with goods, but also carrying something far more deadly: black rats infested with fleas. These fleas were no ordinary insects. They were the carriers of Yersinia pestis, a deadly bacterium that would bring death on an unimaginable scale. When those ships reached the ports of Europe, including the southern coast of England, they brought with them the first flickers of what would soon become a raging inferno. The Black Death was not just a disease, it was a catastrophe that would wipe out roughly 1/3 of England's population in just a few years. Picture a small village in the English countryside. The sun filters weakly through a canopy of gray clouds, casting a cold and muted light on the muddy streets. At first, the villagers notice nothing unusual, but soon an ominous presence settles like a fog. The first cases of plague begin to appear. The symptoms start subtly: a fever, chills, exhaustion. But soon, painful swelling appears, usually in the armpits, neck, or groin. These swollen lumps, called buboes, were the plague's unmistakable mark. They grew large and blackened the skin, causing unbearable pain and sickness. The sight of these buboes was enough to strike terror into anyone's heart. Within days, those who had fallen ill would begin to lose consciousness. Their breathing became shallow, their limbs cold. Death was swift and merciless. Many did not last a week from the onset of symptoms. The worst part was the mystery of it all. No one knew what caused this invisible enemy or how to stop it. Physicians of the time were baffled. They tried everything from bleeding the patient to using strange herbs and potions, but these treatments were useless against the plague. Instead, fear and superstition took root. Priests rushed to the villages, offering prayers and last rites, hoping to save souls if not bodies. But even the church, a pillar of medieval society, was powerless to halt the spread. Some clergy themselves succumbed to the disease, leaving spiritual voids in communities already hollowed by loss. As the plague spread, panic grew. People who once greeted their neighbors warmly now crossed the street to avoid contact. Travelers were shunned and turned away. Fear of contagion tore apart the social fabric that had once bound communities together. Some desperate families locked themselves inside their homes, barring doors and windows, hoping to keep the sickness out. But the fleas and rats were relentless. They slipped through cracks and crevices, carrying death inside. Others fled to the countryside, believing that isolation would protect them. But the plague followed the roads and waterways, spreading into every corner of the kingdom. There was no escape. Entire families disappeared. Fathers, mothers, and children were all taken, often within days of each other. Fields lay fallow because the farmers who tended them were gone. The markets that once bustled with trade grew silent. Shops were shuttered, and the economy staggered under the weight of so many deaths. In the towns, the situation was just as dire. Narrow streets filled with filth and garbage became breeding grounds for disease. Without proper sanitation or understanding of hygiene, the plague flourished. Mass graves became common. With so many dead, the normal rituals of burial could not be maintained. Bodies were stacked in shallow pits, often dug hastily outside the town walls. The smell of death hung in the air, a constant reminder of the grim reality. Fear and confusion bred suspicion and cruelty. As people sought explanations, scapegoats were found. Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease. This led to horrific persecutions, including massacres and expulsions. It was a dark stain on medieval society, a reminder of how fear can twist humanity. Amid this chaos, the government struggled to maintain order. Laws were enacted to try to prevent the spread, such as quarantine measures and bans on gatherings. But enforcement was uneven, and the sheer scale of the epidemic overwhelmed all attempts at control. Economically, the plague's toll was devastating, but paradoxically transformative. With so many workers dead, labor became scarce. Survivors found they could demand higher wages, and this shift slowly began to alter the rigid social structure. Lords and landowners resisted these changes, imposing new laws to keep peasants tied to the land, but the seeds of change had been planted. The psychological impact was profound. People who lived through the plague experienced deep trauma. Entire generations were lost, families broken, communities forever changed. Art and literature of the time reflect this bleak outlook, with themes of death and mortality becoming dominant. Yet, life persisted. Villages that were abandoned slowly repopulated over decades. Trade routes reopened and towns rebuilt. The plague would return in cycles, but each outbreak was less deadly than the last as populations developed some immunity. The Black Death left an indelible mark on England. It reshaped the population, the economy, the culture, and even the way people thought about life and death. It was a harsh reminder that in medieval England, survival was never assured and that death was often only a few steps away. So now, as you begin to drift towards sleep, picture the silent streets once filled with life, the empty homes, and the graves outside the village boundaries. Imagine the sorrow, the fear, and the flickering hope that kept some going through those darkest days. Rest peacefully, for you have escaped the plague for now. Filth everywhere, living without sewers, soap, or sanity. Open cesspits, chamber pots tossed into the streets, and why bathing was rare. Imagine waking up in a small medieval village or town in England. The air is thick with a mixture of smoke, livestock smells, and something else, a heavy, pungent odor that lingers everywhere. This smell is not just the product of daily life, it is the product of centuries of accumulated filth. Life in medieval England was dirty, grimy, and harsh, especially when it came to hygiene. Unlike modern cities with their underground sewer systems and waste management, medieval towns were a tangled web of open cesspits, muddy streets, and piles of garbage. Sanitation as we know it simply did not exist. Instead, people dealt with their waste in the most straightforward and frankly disgusting ways imaginable. One of the most common sights in any medieval town would have been chamber pots. These were basically pots or buckets kept in homes for people to relieve themselves during the night or when going outside was inconvenient. In theory, these pots would be emptied into designated areas, but more often than not, they were simply dumped into the street or the nearest open ditch. In a crowded town like London or York, this meant that streets were often rivers of urine and worse. People walked through these muddy, fetid lanes daily, stepping over animal dung and human waste alike. The streets were not paved, and drainage was poor or non-existent, so rains would mix with the filth and create a slick, slippery mess that spread disease and stench. The stench must have been overwhelming, especially during warmer months. Imagine the smell of rotting vegetables, animal manure, human excrement, and the smoke from cooking fires all mingling together. For the medieval English, this was the everyday reality. Bathing was another matter entirely. Despite popular myths, medieval people were not uniformly filthy by choice. Many valued cleanliness. However, regular bathing was extremely rare. The reasons were many. Bathing facilities were scarce, privacy was limited, and water was often unsafe or too precious to waste. Most people bathed only a few times a year, sometimes only after a religious holiday or special occasion. The wealthy might have had access to wooden tubs or bathhouses, but these were luxuries beyond the reach of common folk. Public bathhouses did exist in towns and cities, but they were often communal and not always sanitary. The water was reused by many bathers, making these places hotspots for the spread of skin diseases and other infections. Over time, many people began to fear public bathhouses, especially as the Black Death swept through England. They came to associate bathing with disease rather than cleanliness. Soap, as we know it, was also not widely available. Medieval soap was crude, made from animal fat and ashes, and often expensive. For most peasants, washing was limited to rinsing with water or wiping with a cloth. Hand washing before meals was not a common practice, which contributed to the spread of disease. Open cesspits were another major problem. These pits were often dug near homes or along roadsides and used as dumping grounds for human waste and garbage. Because they were uncovered, flies and rodents were attracted to them, becoming carriers of disease. Waste from these cesspits could leach into wells and streams, the main sources of drinking water, contaminating what little clean water was available. This contamination fueled outbreaks of diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, illnesses that were just as deadly as the plague in medieval England. In rural villages, the situation was slightly different, but no less grim. Farms had privies, or outhouses, but they were primitive and often emptied into the fields or nearby woods. Animal dung was everywhere since livestock lived close to human dwellings, adding to the mess and smell. Children played in dirt yards that were shared with pigs, chickens, and cows. The lines between animals and humans were blurred in these cramped, unsanitary conditions. Food preparation and storage were also affected by poor hygiene. Without refrigeration, food would spoil quickly. Flies and rodents carried germs from the filth to the food, further increasing the risk of illness. It wasn't just physical health that suffered from this lack of sanitation. The mental toll of living surrounded by filth and disease must have been enormous. The ever-present stench, the constant fear of sickness, and the social stigma attached to dirtiness weighed heavily on people's spirits. Religious teachings did encourage cleanliness to some extent. Baptism involved water, and holy water was believed to have purifying properties. But the gap between spiritual cleanliness and physical cleanliness was vast. For many, survival depended on toughening themselves to the harsh realities of their environment rather than trying to escape them. Some medieval reformers and rulers did try to improve hygiene. Town councils occasionally passed ordinances requiring streets to be cleaned or waste to be disposed of properly. In some places, people were fined for throwing waste in the street, but enforcement was difficult and traditions died hard. Despite the filth, medieval people were remarkably resilient. They adapted their habits to cope with their environment. Some kept animals far from their homes, stored water in covered barrels, and used herbs to mask odors or repel insects. Even so, the lack of sanitation was a significant factor in the high mortality rates of the period. Before antibiotics and modern medicine, diseases spread easily and quickly in these conditions, especially among the poor. As you reflect on these grim realities, consider how far humanity has come. Today's flush toilets, clean running water, and soaps may seem mundane, but they are miracles compared to the filth that surrounded medieval people every day. So as you drift towards sleep, remember the muddy streets, the chamber pots emptied into the gutters, the open cesspits buzzing with flies, and the rare, precious moments when a few lucky souls bathed and washed away some of the grime. Sleep well, knowing you live in a time when sanitation is no longer a nightmare, but a simple part of daily life. Your daily bread might kill you. Food, famine, and flat ale. Rotten grain, tainted meat, and brewing ale just to avoid drinking water. Picture this. It's early morning in medieval England, and you're about to eat your first meal of the day. It's likely bread, dense, coarse, and sometimes sour, and maybe a small portion of cheese or a bit of pottage, a kind of thick vegetable stew. But while this sounds simple, the reality is far from comforting. Your daily bread might very well be dangerous to your health, and your drink? Often flat ale, because the alternative, water, could be a death sentence. Food in medieval England was a gamble, and hunger was a constant threat. The diet for most common folk was monotonous, heavily reliant on bread, grains, and whatever vegetables they could grow or forage. Meat was a rare luxury, mostly eaten by the wealthy or on special occasions. When meat was available, it was often spoiled or tainted, increasing the risk of illness. Let's begin with the staple, bread. It was everywhere, at every meal, for every person, but not the soft, fluffy bread we enjoy today. Medieval bread was made from coarse grains, often rye or barley mixed with wheat if available. It was dense, dark, and full of grit because milling technology was rudimentary. Stone mills could not separate all the husks and chaff, so bread was gritty and tough to chew. Worse still, grain could spoil or become contaminated with mold or fungi, producing toxic substances like ergot. Ergot poisoning caused convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death, a terrifying fate called St. Anthony's fire by medieval doctors. Poor storage techniques made spoilage common. Grain was kept in sacks or barns vulnerable to moisture, insects, and rodents. Rats and mice would contaminate the stores, further spreading disease. When famine struck, which it often did, grain was in short supply or utterly unavailable. Bad harvests due to bad weather, pests, or war meant that the most basic food source could disappear. Famines led to starvation, weakened immune systems, and desperation. Vegetables were a crucial supplement, but the options were limited. Cabbage, onions, leeks, and beans were common, but not always plentiful. These vegetables were often boiled in pottage, which was the daily stew of peasants. Pottage was cooked for hours over open fires, combining whatever ingredients were at hand. It could be thick and nourishing, but sometimes it was watery and tasteless. Meat was a luxury. Hunting was mostly restricted to the nobility, and peasants were banned from killing game on noble lands. Most villagers kept some livestock, chickens, pigs, goats, or cows, but these animals were often reserved for breeding or special occasions. When meat was consumed, it was often poorly preserved. Medieval people had no refrigeration, so they salted, smoked, or dried meat to keep it longer. However, improper curing could cause spoilage and dangerous bacteria growth. Eating spoiled meat caused food poisoning and fatal diseases. Fish was an important protein source, especially for religious reasons. Many medieval Christians fasted from meat on certain days and instead ate fish. But fresh fish was perishable and only available near rivers, lakes, or coasts. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you: ale. Ale was a daily drink for most medieval English, regardless of age or class. But why? Because clean drinking water was a rare and risky commodity. Water sources, wells, streams, and rivers were often contaminated by sewage, animal waste, and runoff. Drinking untreated water could quickly lead to dysentery, cholera, and other deadly diseases. Ale, by contrast, was brewed by boiling water with malted grains and fermented by natural yeasts. This process killed many harmful microbes and made ale safer to drink than water. Medieval ale was often low in alcohol, more like a mild, nutritious broth, but it was consumed constantly throughout the day to stave off thirst and hunger. Brewing ale was often a household chore. Women brewed small batches daily for family consumption. Taverns and alehouses provided communal spaces for drinking and socializing. But ale was not without its downsides. Poor sanitation in breweries or storage vessels could lead to contamination. Some alehouses watered down their products, which might cause stomach issues or even poisonings. Excessive consumption of ale could also lead to drunkenness, which in a harsh world had serious consequences. Hunger and famine were common and terrifying threats. Medieval England experienced several famines, such as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when heavy rains destroyed crops and caused widespread starvation. During these times, food prices soared, and many families faced desperate choices: scavenging roots, eating bark, or even turning to cannibalism in extreme cases. Even in good years, food shortages could occur. Poor harvests, war, and disease outbreaks all disrupted the fragile food supply. This scarcity made medieval people wary and resourceful. They stored grains, dried fruits, and salted meats whenever possible. Malnutrition was widespread. Lack of vitamins and proteins weakened immune systems, making people more vulnerable to infections. The poor diet also affected children, causing stunted growth and higher mortality. Seasonality was another challenge. Fresh fruits and vegetables were only available during certain months. In winter, diets were limited to stored grains, salted or smoked meats, and dried legumes. This seasonal hunger cycle was brutal. Interestingly, medieval people developed various folk remedies and superstitions around food. Certain herbs were believed to protect against poison or illness. Eating certain foods at specific times was thought to bring luck or ward off evil. Despite the hardships, food was also a source of social identity and religious significance. Feasts and festivals featured lavish meals for the elite, while commoners enjoyed simpler fare. Bread was symbolic of life itself, and religious rituals often involved breaking bread together. So when you think about the bread and ale of medieval England, remember this: your daily meal was a mix of survival, risk, and ritual. The coarse, often spoiled bread, the tainted meat, the reliance on flat ale. These were the realities of a world where starvation and sickness lurked behind every meal. Tonight, as you settle in, be grateful for your modern kitchen and clean water. Because back then, every bite and every sip could mean the difference between life and death. Where's the tea? A country without comfort. No sugar, no tea, no coffee, just weak ale and plain porridge. Imagine waking up on a cold, damp morning in medieval England. The air is thick with fog and the smell of smoke from hearth fires. Your body aches from the previous day's labor in the fields, and your stomach grumbles in hunger. You seek warmth and comfort, maybe a hot drink to soothe your tired muscles and calm your restless mind. But such comforts are nowhere to be found. You won't find a steaming cup of tea or coffee here. Those drinks are centuries away from reaching England's shores. Tea, a delicate, aromatic infusion made from dried leaves, originated in ancient China and would not be introduced to England until the 17th century, brought by traders from the East India Company. Coffee, similarly, was first cultivated in Yemen and spread to Europe much later. Neither existed during the Middle Ages, a period that stretched roughly from the 5th to the late 15th century. So what did medieval Englishmen drink? The most common beverage was ale, often weak, sometimes sour, but almost always safer to consume than the frequently contaminated water supply. Ale was brewed locally in small batches by households or village brewers, and it was consumed by adults and children alike. This small beer was often the only hydration available during the day. For many, it was served warm, particularly in the cold months, offering some comfort against the chill. Now, what about food? The staple breakfast of a medieval peasant was usually a bowl of porridge, made from oats or barley boiled in water, or if lucky, milk. This thick, bland mush was filling and cheap, but far from delicious. It lacked any sweeteners, no honey or sugar for the poor, and was eaten plain or with a sprinkle of salt or herbs, if anything. Sugar, as we know it, was an entirely different luxury. It was an imported commodity, arriving in England through long trade routes from the Middle East and Asia. It was prohibitively expensive and reserved mostly for the wealthy elite. Honey, slightly more accessible, was sometimes used as a sweetener, but still a rare treat for common folk. The absence of sweet flavors in medieval diets was a stark contrast to modern palates accustomed to sugar in almost everything we eat and drink. The lack of sugar also meant no sweetened tea or coffee, drinks that today provide comfort and stimulation through caffeine and sweetness. Instead, the medieval English drank weak ale that was often bitter or sour. This was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Water was often polluted, carrying diseases that could be deadly, so ale was a safer alternative despite its low alcohol content. Because of these limitations, the medieval diet could feel harsh and joyless. Mealtimes were functional rather than pleasurable. People ate quickly, often standing or while working, and the idea of sitting down for a leisurely meal with comforting beverages was a rarity for the lower classes. Alehouses were one of the few places where common folk could socialize and relax. Yet even these communal spots offered only what was available locally: weak ale, hard bread, and simple fare like cheese or salted meat. The experience was nothing like the cozy cafes we enjoy today, with their rich brews and sweet pastries. The wealthy, on the other hand, had access to spices such as cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, which were imported from Asia via complex trade routes. These spices were prized not only for flavor, but also as status symbols. They were used to season meat and enrich sauces, transforming bland dishes into festive meals. However, these exotic ingredients were beyond the reach of peasants and small farmers. Sugar, when it did arrive in Europe, was rare and expensive, often used sparingly by the nobility to sweeten desserts and drinks. It would take centuries before sugar became affordable and widespread in European diets. This lack of sweet food and drink shaped the medieval palate. People were accustomed to sour, bitter, and savory flavors. Sweetness was an exotic flavor, sometimes even thought to be medicinal or magical. Many people viewed sweet foods and spices as indulgent or sinful, fitting into the religious context of moderation and fasting. Religion played a large role in dietary customs. Medieval Christians observed numerous fasting days, during which meat, dairy, and rich foods were forbidden. This meant that even the well-off experienced times when their diet was reduced to simple bread, legumes, and vegetables, all without sugar or sweet beverages. The porridge itself was a symbol of survival, cheap and easy to make in large quantities. However, cooking conditions were primitive. Without modern stoves or cooking vessels, porridge was often boiled in large pots over open fires, prone to burning or becoming gritty due to unrefined grains. Grain milling was also a laborious process, with most families grinding oats or barley by hand using stones. This coarse grinding left bits of husk and chaff in the flour, contributing to a coarse texture in porridge and bread. Combined with the absence of refined sugars or flavorings, medieval food was often plain and unpalatable by modern standards. Medieval kitchens lacked the variety of ingredients and equipment we take for granted today. Food preservation methods were limited to salting, drying, smoking, or fermenting, techniques that impacted flavor and nutrition. Fresh fruits were seasonal and rare. Vegetables were basic and often boiled or roasted. Without caffeinated drinks like tea or coffee, energy levels depended on solid food and physical conditioning. People relied on short naps, steady work rhythms, and herbal remedies to manage fatigue. These remedies, often based on folklore, included drinking ale with herbs or consuming bitter teas made from plants like wormwood or chamomile. But their effects were mild and inconsistent. Despite these hardships, medieval people found comfort in social traditions and seasonal festivities. During festivals such as harvest time or Christmas, special foods appeared: honey cakes, spiced wine, and meat dishes flavored with imported spices. These celebrations offered rare moments of indulgence and joy amidst the daily struggle. The absence of tea, coffee, and sugar in medieval England also profoundly influenced the course of European culinary history. When these commodities finally arrived through trade in the 16th and 17th centuries, they revolutionized social habits, trade economies, and cuisine. Coffee houses became centers of intellectual exchange. Tea became a national obsession. Sugar transformed desserts and daily diets. But for centuries before, medieval Englishmen lived without these comforts. They endured cold mornings, bland breakfasts, and monotonous meals, relying on weak ale and plain porridge to sustain them. So next time you enjoy a hot cup of tea or coffee, or sweeten your meal with sugar, remember that countless generations lived without these simple comforts, surviving in a world where warmth and sweetness were rare luxuries, not everyday pleasures, born into bondage, feudalism, and the lack of freedom. Serfs bound to their lords with no legal right to leave or own land. Imagine waking up in a time when your entire existence is predetermined by birth. You don't just belong to a family or a village. Legally, you belong to a landowner, a lord who controls not only the fields and forests around you, but also your very life. This was the reality for millions in medieval England, living under the brutal system of feudalism, where freedom was a concept almost completely foreign to the common peasant. To understand feudal England, you need to picture a strictly hierarchical society where every person has a fixed place. At the very top sits the king, who owns the entire kingdom in theory. Beneath him are powerful nobles and barons granted large tracts of land in return for loyalty and military service. Below these elites are the knights and lesser landowners, and at the bottom, the vast majority, the peasants, most of whom were serfs. Serfs were peasants bound to the land, legally tied to the manor of their lord. Unlike free peasants, serfs could not lawfully leave the estate without permission, own property outright, or marry freely without the lord's consent. They were effectively the lord's property in a system that linked them forever to the soil they worked. The feudal system was built around a network of mutual obligations, but these obligations heavily favored the landowners. Lords provided land, protection, and a form of justice, while peasants gave labor, goods, and various payments. But the power imbalance was extreme. For serfs, the lord's authority was absolute and often harsh. From the moment you're born, your fate is tied to the manor. Your parents and grandparents lived and died bound to the land, and you will too. You don't own the house you live in. It belongs to your lord. The small strip of farmland you tend to feed your family is rented from the lord. Rent paid not in money, but in crops, livestock, or labor. Your daily life revolves around the demanding and exhausting work on the fields. From dawn to dusk, you toil, plowing, planting, weeding, and harvesting crops such as wheat, barley, oats, and rye. Your family's survival depends on a successful harvest, but the Lord's dues remain fixed. Even in years of famine or poor yield, your obligation to pay rent and provide labor doesn't decrease. Labor services demanded by your Lord are relentless. You may be required to spend several days each week working directly on the Lord's demesne, the land reserved for the Lord's own use, repairing fences, maintaining roads, or harvesting crops. This unpaid labor is in addition to the work you do to support your family's plot. Your rights, if they exist at all, are minimal. You have no legal ownership of land and no freedom to move away. The Lord's Manor Court governs your life, enforcing rules and meting out punishments for infractions ranging from failing to meet your obligations to petty disputes with neighbors. The punishment for disobedience or attempting to escape can be severe. Lords had the power to imprison, fine, or physically punish serfs. If a serf ran away and stayed outside the manor for more than a year and a day, some could claim freedom, but this was rare and risky. Most who tried to flee were caught and returned, often suffering brutal consequences. Marriage was controlled as well. A serf needed the lord's approval to marry, especially if the marriage involved leaving the manor or bringing in outsiders. This ensured the lord maintained control over his workforce and resources. Feudal obligations also included various incidents, fees and taxes that serfs had to pay on special occasions. When a serf inherited land, married, or passed away, the lord claimed a portion of the value as dues. These fees could be crippling for a poor peasant family. The medieval church reinforced this system with religious doctrine, preaching that the social order was divinely ordained. People were taught that their suffering was a test of faith and that eternal reward awaited the obedient and humble in the afterlife. This spiritual justification made it easier for lords to maintain their grip over the peasantry. Housing for serfs was simple and sparse. Most lived in small one-room huts made from wattle and daub, with dirt floors and thatched roofs. These homes were often cold and drafty, with a smoky fire in the center providing warmth but little ventilation. Privacy was non-existent, and space was shared with animals during winter months for additional warmth. Food for serfs was basic and often monotonous. Their diet consisted mostly of coarse bread, pottage, a thick vegetable stew, and occasionally salted or smoked meat. Malnutrition was common, especially in bad years when crops failed or rents ate into family provisions. Despite the hardships, serfs formed tight-knit communities. Villages centered around the manor church, which was often the only stone building in the area, and a place of both spiritual refuge and social gathering. Festivals and holy days offered rare breaks from toil and a chance for celebration. In some cases, serfs could buy their freedom, though this was difficult and rare. Manumission required the lord's agreement and enough money to compensate for the lost labor. Free peasants did exist, but were a small minority and still lived precariously. Feudalism lasted in England well into the late Middle Ages, with the Black Death in the 14th century shaking the foundations of the system. The massive population loss meant labor became scarce, giving surviving peasants more bargaining power. Some serfs began to demand better conditions or even freedom. Over time, the rigid bonds of serfdom loosened, and by the 16th century, serfdom largely disappeared in England. But during the height of the medieval period, the vast majority of people were trapped in a harsh cycle of bondage and labor with little hope of escape. So, if you woke up in medieval England as a serf, your life would be defined by hard work, legal servitude, and near total lack of freedom. Your every move, your family, your survival, all controlled by a lord whose interests were often far removed from your own. In a world without basic human rights as we know them, being born a serf was essentially being born a slave to the land and to the demands of feudal power. Freedom was not a birthright, but a distant dream, and your life, for better or worse, belonged to another. The doctor will bleed you now, medieval medicine and mayhem. No antibiotics, no understanding of germs, just leeches, herbs, and superstition. If you woke up in medieval England feeling unwell, the chances of getting effective treatment were slim to none. Unlike today, where a visit to the doctor often means a quick diagnosis, a prescription, or a surgical procedure in a sterile environment, medieval medicine was a baffling mix of ancient theories, religious beliefs, herbal remedies, and sometimes outright harmful practices. The very concept of illness was misunderstood. There were no antibiotics to fight infections, no knowledge about bacteria or viruses, and most doctors had little more than books and superstition to guide their hands. You would have been at the mercy of whatever healer you could afford, and even then, survival was far from guaranteed. At the core of medieval medical theory was the idea of the four humors, a concept inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. According to this theory, the human body was made up of four vital fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Good health meant these humors were in perfect balance. Disease, however, was thought to result from an imbalance, too much blood, or perhaps an excess of black bile. Treatments were therefore aimed at restoring balance, often by draining blood or causing vomiting and diarrhea to purge the body. But while this might sound scientific for its time, it was mostly guesswork, and the methods often weakened patients further. In fact, bloodletting, the removal of blood via cuts or leeches, was one of the most commonly prescribed cures, yet it was dangerous and rarely helpful. Overlaying these medical theories was a powerful religious framework. Medieval people believed that illness was not just a physical problem, but a spiritual one. Disease was frequently viewed as punishment from God for sins committed, or as a test of faith. This belief meant that alongside medical treatment, prayer, pilgrimages to holy shrines, and the touching of relics were common components of healing. Monks and priests often served as healers themselves, offering prayers and holy water rather than physical remedies. This spiritual aspect could provide comfort, but it also limited the development of more practical medical treatments because it framed disease as divine will rather than a natural process that could be studied and treated scientifically. The healers available in medieval England came from different walks of life and offered vastly different levels of skill and knowledge. Physicians were the most educated, but also the rarest. They studied ancient texts in universities, but their education was largely theoretical and based on classical writings rather than practical experience. They often prescribed herbal remedies, dietary changes, and bloodletting, but their treatments were expensive and mostly available to nobles or clergy. Most common people could not afford a physician. Instead, many relied on barber surgeons and who were not doctors but performed surgeries, bloodletting, and tooth extractions. Barbers held a strange hybrid role, combining hair cutting with rudimentary medical procedures. Surgery itself was brutal. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptics, and no sterile environment. Patients endured excruciating pain, and infections were rampant. Surgeons used crude, often unclean tools to amputate limbs or drain abscesses, making survival uncertain. In villages and towns, apothecaries filled the role of early pharmacists, preparing herbal concoctions, ointments, and powders. These remedies were often based on traditional knowledge or old recipes, but lacked consistent effectiveness. Wise women, midwives, and folk healers also played a crucial role in rural communities. Their knowledge of local herbs and remedies was passed down through generations, but many of their treatments were based on superstition or ritual. Some remedies worked, others caused poisoning or harm, and sometimes these healers were accused of witchcraft and persecuted. One of the most notorious treatments of the time was bloodletting. Based on the theory of humoral imbalance, physicians and barber surgeons would remove blood through cuts or by attaching leeches to the skin. Leeches were prized for their ability to suck blood gently, but excessive bloodletting often weakened patients, sometimes causing death. Yet, it was prescribed for almost every ailment, from fevers to headaches, without scientific backing. Herbs were central to medieval medicine, but knowledge was inconsistent and often dangerous. Willow bark was used to ease pain, as it contained salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin. Garlic was thought to have healing and antiseptic properties, while herbs like lavender and rosemary were used to treat wounds and respiratory issues. However, some plants like mandrake and deadly nightshade were highly toxic and could cause severe harm or death if misused. Apothecaries and herbalists relied on manuscripts and word of mouth, but without standard doses or scientific trials, many treatments were a gamble. When epidemics struck, such as the Black Death in the 14th century, medieval medicine was overwhelmed and helpless. The bubonic plague killed millions, and doctors could do little but watch. The cause was unknown. Many blamed bad air or divine punishment. Treatments included carrying sweet-smelling herbs or fumigating rooms with incense to clear the miasma. Some doctors tried cutting open buboes to drain pus, a dangerous practice that often led to further infection. Hospitals were few and primarily run by religious orders, serving as places for prayer and basic care rather than effective treatment. Surgery was equally grim. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, patients were fully conscious during operations, often held down by assistants to prevent movement. Instruments were crude and reused without cleaning, leading to infections that were often fatal. Common surgeries like amputations were last resorts, performed only when limbs were gangrenous or injured beyond hope. Recovery was uncertain, and many died from shock, blood loss, or infection. Superstition and religion intertwined deeply with medicine. Many believed illnesses were caused by evil spirits or witchcraft. Healing often involved charms, amulets, holy water, and prayers to saints. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common in hopes of miraculous cures. However, fear of witches and sorcerers sometimes led to accusations and trials, adding hysteria to the already dire health crises. Poor hygiene made matters worse. Medieval towns had no modern sewage systems. Streets were filled with human and animal waste, and cesspits often overflowed into the open air. Bathing was infrequent. Many believed that washing opened pores to harmful spirits. Doctors themselves did not wash hands or tools between patients. This lack of cleanliness facilitated the spread of disease, especially in crowded cities. Childbirth was a perilous time for women. Without prenatal care or sterile environments, complications like hemorrhage or infection were common killers. Midwives assisted in deliveries, but had little medical knowledge beyond traditional methods. Infant mortality was extraordinarily high. Many children died before their first birthday due to poor nutrition and disease. Mental illness was misunderstood and feared. Those suffering from what we now recognize as mental health disorders were often thought possessed or morally weak. Treatments ranged from religious rites and exorcisms to confinement or physical punishment. Compassion was scarce, and many mentally ill individuals were hidden away or left to suffer. In summary, the medical world of medieval England was a mix of fear, superstition, partial knowledge, and sometimes cruel practices. Without understanding germs or how diseases spread, people lived in constant danger from infections and ailments that are now easily treatable. The healers of the time, whether learned physicians or village herbalists, did their best with the tools and beliefs they had. But the odds of surviving serious illness were low. The Middle Ages were a harsh era where even the simple act of falling ill could quickly become a matter of life or death. Punishment medieval style, brutality by law. Execution by hanging, branding, and trial by ordeal. Justice was terrifying. In medieval England, justice was swift, brutal, and often terrifying. The legal system was a reflection of the harsh realities of the time, where survival often depended on obeying the law, and those laws were enforced with ruthless severity. Crime and punishment were closely intertwined with social order, and penalties were designed not only to punish offenders, but also to instill fear in the populace. Whether you were a peasant, a merchant, or even a minor noble, the consequences for breaking the law could be horrifying and permanent. The medieval justice system offered little in the way of fairness or mercy, and the punishments could be cruel beyond modern comprehension. The most common form of capital punishment was hanging. For many crimes, especially theft, murder, or rebellion, the sentence was death by hanging. Public executions were more than just a method to end a life. They were a spectacle meant to serve as a warning to all who witnessed. These events were often held in town squares or near marketplaces, where crowds gathered to watch the condemned meet their fate. The noose was a grim symbol of justice, and death by hanging was not always quick or painless. Miscalculations in the drop could lead to strangulation rather than a swift neck break, resulting in prolonged suffering. The bodies of the executed were sometimes left hanging as a gruesome reminder to others. Hanging was not the only form of execution. For crimes considered especially heinous, such as treason or heresy, punishments could be far more barbaric. Drawing and quartering was a dreaded sentence reserved for traitors. The condemned was dragged to the execution site, hanged, but often cut down while still alive, disemboweled, beheaded, and finally cut into 4 parts. This horrific process was meant to demonstrate the ultimate power of the crown and deter anyone from defying royal authority. Burning at the stake was another terrifying method, primarily used for those accused of heresy or witchcraft. Victims were tied to wooden stakes and set ablaze, often in public gatherings. The agony was immense and meant to cleanse the soul through fire. Beyond execution, medieval England used a range of corporal punishments to inflict pain and humiliation without killing. Branding was a common penalty for theft or other crimes. The offender was marked with a hot iron, often on the face or hand, permanently identifying them as a criminal. This branding served as a lifelong stigma, ensuring the person was recognized and shunned in the community. Mutilation was also used as punishment. Cutting off ears, noses, or even hands was not uncommon for repeat offenders or those who committed violent crimes. These punishments were both physical and psychological, designed to degrade and mark the criminal for life. The law also relied heavily on public humiliation. Stocks and pillories were devices used to restrain offenders in the town square for hours or days. The offender would be locked in a wooden frame with their head and hands secured, exposing them to ridicule, verbal abuse, and even physical assault by passers-by who might throw rotten vegetables or stones. This form of punishment was meant to shame and socially isolate the criminal, deterring others from breaking the law. Trial by ordeal was another grim feature of medieval justice, reflecting the deeply religious beliefs of the time. When evidence was scarce or contested, the accused might be subjected to a trial by ordeal, a test believed to reveal divine judgment. There were various types of ordeals. One common method was the ordeal by fire, where the accused had to hold a red-hot iron or walk barefoot over burning coals. If the wounds healed cleanly within a set period, it was taken as a sign of innocence. Another ordeal was by water. The accused was tied up and thrown into a river or pond. If they floated, it meant guilt because the water rejected the impure. But if they sank and drowned, they were considered innocent, though obviously many innocent people died this way. The ordeal by combat was another form, especially among the nobility. Disputes could be settled by a physical fight under the belief that God would grant victory to the just party. While this practice was less common among peasants, it underscored the medieval reliance on divine intervention in justice. Punishments for minor crimes could still be harsh and demeaning. Thieves might have their hands cut off or faces branded, while those caught stealing food faced public whipping or fines that could ruin a family. Vagabonds and beggars were often rounded up and subjected to corporal punishment or forced labor. The law harshly regulated social order and mobility, reinforcing the strict class structure of feudal society. The medieval court system itself was quite different from modern courts. Local manorial courts dealt with petty crimes and disputes among peasants, often led by the lord of the manor or his steward. More serious cases went to royal courts or itinerant judges traveling the country. Trials were not guaranteed to be fair or impartial. Evidence standards were low, and accusations could be based on hearsay or personal vendettas. Torture was sometimes used to extract confessions, further undermining justice. Church courts existed alongside secular courts, handling moral and religious offenses such as adultery, blasphemy, or heresy. These courts also imposed harsh penalties, including excommunication, imprisonment, or public penance, which could ruin a person's social standing. Capital punishment was widespread, but executions were not the only way to maintain order. Fines, forced labor, banishment were also used, though prisons were rudimentary and primarily holding places before trial or execution, rather than places for rehabilitation. Life in medieval prisons was grim, with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and little food. The brutal justice system also reflected the rigid social hierarchy. Nobles often received more lenient treatment or could pay fines to avoid harsh punishment, while peasants faced the full force of the law for minor infractions. Women faced additional dangers. Crimes like theft or adultery could lead to public shaming, whipping, or worse, and accusations of witchcraft could result in execution. Understanding medieval justice means recognizing it was designed to control a rough, often lawless society where survival was precarious. The fear of brutal punishment was a crucial tool for maintaining order. While horrifying to modern eyes, these punishments were accepted as necessary to keep peace and enforce authority. If you had lived in medieval England, a simple accusation could lead to terrifying consequences. The risk of execution, mutilation, or public humiliation was constant. The justice system was neither kind nor forgiving, and the law was often an instrument of power rather than fairness. Surviving the medieval world meant walking a fine line, with brutal punishment always lurking just beyond the horizon. The life of a medieval woman: work, worry, and widowhood. Constant labor, no rights, childbirth dangers, and early death. Life for a woman in medieval England was a continuous cycle of hard work, worry, and endurance. Unlike the romanticized images of noble ladies in flowing gowns or maidens waiting for rescue, the reality for the vast majority of women was grueling from dawn until dusk, with few rights, limited freedoms, and constant threats to their health and survival. Whether a peasant laborer, a merchant's wife, or a noblewoman, a medieval woman's life was shaped by rigid social expectations, legal restrictions, and the physical demands of daily survival. The overwhelming majority of women were peasants, living in small villages or on manorial estates. Their day began early, often before sunrise, with an endless list of chores and responsibilities. Farming was the backbone of medieval society, and women played a crucial role in agricultural labor. They helped sow and harvest crops, tended animals, and maintained the household garden. But their duties didn't end in the fields. Women were responsible for preparing food for the family, which meant grinding grain into flour, using heavy querns, baking bread in communal ovens, and cooking meals on open hearths, a physically demanding and time-consuming process. In addition to cooking, women were tasked with fetching water from wells or rivers, a laborious chore that could take hours each day. Water was needed not only for drinking and cooking, but also for washing clothes, which was another strenuous task. Medieval clothes were heavy and cumbersome, often made from wool or linen, and required frequent cleaning to prevent illness and infestation by lice and fleas. Washing clothes involved boiling water over the fire, scrubbing garments on washboards or stones, and hanging them to dry, a job especially grueling in cold or rainy weather. Women also spun wool or flax into thread and wove cloth on rudimentary looms, often working late into the night by candlelight. Textile production was essential for making clothing, blankets, and household textiles. This work required both skill and patience and was typically carried out by women alongside their other duties. For many, spinning and weaving were a form of income, as excess cloth or yarn could be sold or bartered in local markets. In the home, women took on childcare and domestic management. Raising children was a relentless and sometimes heartbreaking endeavor. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high. It was common for a woman to lose multiple children in infancy or early childhood due to disease, malnutrition, or poor sanitation. Mothers faced the constant anxiety of protecting their offspring from these dangers while also ensuring they were fed and clothed. Education for children, if it happened at all, was usually informal and undertaken by mothers. Childbirth was one of the most perilous experiences a medieval woman could face. Without modern medical care or knowledge of hygiene, many women died during or shortly after childbirth. Midwives, often experienced older women from the community, assisted with deliveries, but their remedies and practices were rooted in superstition and limited knowledge. Complications such as obstructed labor, infection, known as puerperal fever, or hemorrhage were common and frequently fatal. Pregnant women also faced social pressures and religious expectations, with childbearing seen as their primary role in life. Legally, women in medieval England had very few rights. They were largely considered the property or responsibility of their fathers, husbands, or male relatives. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was subsumed under that of her husband. This meant she could not own property independently, enter contracts, or represent herself in court. Widows had more rights, especially if they inherited land or property, but even then, their autonomy was limited. Marriage was often less about love and more about alliance, economics, or survival. Families arranged marriages to consolidate wealth, land, or power. Women were expected to marry young, sometimes as early as their early teens, and produce children, preferably sons, to inherit family estates. Failure to bear children, especially sons, could lead to social stigma or worse. Divorce was virtually non-existent for most people. Marriage was a binding contract in the eyes of both the law and the church. Widowhood brought both hardships and opportunities. On one hand, widows faced economic vulnerability, social isolation, and the risk of exploitation. Without a husband's protection, many widows struggled to support themselves and their children. On the other hand, some widows managed to gain relative independence. If they inherited land or wealth, they could wield influence within their community or family. Some widows remarried, which could restore their social and economic standing, But remarriage also meant a loss of control over their property and lives. In the urban centers, women's lives were somewhat different, but no less challenging. Women could work as merchants, bakers, brewers, or in various crafts. Some even joined guilds, though often in limited roles compared to men. Yet, women in towns also faced legal and social restrictions, and their work was often undervalued. Urban women had to navigate crowded, unsanitary conditions rife with disease. Fire was a constant threat, as wooden buildings crowded narrow streets. Women also faced dangers beyond labor and law. Accusations of witchcraft or heresy could have deadly consequences, especially in times of social unrest or famine, when scapegoating was common. A woman who did not conform to social norms, whether through speech, behavior, or appearance, risked suspicion and persecution. The infamous witch hunts of later centuries had their roots in medieval anxieties about female power and independence. Despite these challenges, women found ways to exert influence and resist oppression. Some noblewomen managed estates or even led armies in their husband's absence. Religious life offered another avenue for women's agency. Becoming a nun could provide education, community, and relative freedom from the constraints of marriage and family. Many women were deeply involved in the spiritual life of their communities, acting as healers, midwives, or mystics. The emotional toll on medieval women was immense. The constant labor, lack of autonomy, and ever-present threat of death shaped a life filled with resilience, but also fear and sorrow. Yet, they were the backbone of medieval society, sustaining families, farms, and communities. Their work often went unrecorded or unrecognized by historians, but without their tireless efforts, medieval England would not have functioned. In summary, the life of a medieval woman was marked by endless toil, few rights, and significant dangers. From dawn to dusk, women labored to provide for their families, often with little reward or recognition. The specter of death from childbirth or disease loomed large, and legal systems favored men at every turn. Yet, in the face of these hardships, women persevered, shaping the very fabric of medieval English society. Their stories remind us that history is not just about kings and battles, but about the everyday struggles and strength of ordinary people. Growing up isn't easy, why most kids didn't make it. Child mortality was high, and children were expected to work by age 7. In medieval England, childhood was a perilous and brief stage of life, starkly different from the relatively protected and carefree childhoods most people know today. The grim reality was that the majority of children born into medieval society did not survive into adulthood. For those who did, the transition from infancy to adulthood was abrupt and fraught with responsibilities that today would seem overwhelming for any child. One of the most brutal facts about medieval childhood was the extraordinarily high mortality rate. Estimates suggest that around 30 to 50% of children died before their 5th birthday, and many more succumbed before reaching adolescence. The causes of these early deaths were manifold. Infectious diseases like measles, smallpox, dysentery, and whooping cough were rampant, thriving in the unsanitary conditions of medieval towns and villages. The absence of effective medical knowledge, vaccines, or antibiotics meant that once a child contracted one of these illnesses, survival was uncertain at best. Poor nutrition further weakened children's ability to fight off disease. Medieval diets, especially for the peasantry, were monotonous and lacking in vital nutrients. Bread, pottage, a type of stew, and ale formed the staples, but vitamins and minerals necessary for healthy development were often missing. Malnutrition not only contributed directly to child mortality, but also made surviving children more vulnerable to infections and slowed physical and cognitive development. Infant care was rudimentary. Breastfeeding was common, but often supplemented with animal milk or gruel, which could be contaminated and cause illness. Wet nurses were sometimes employed by wealthier families, but their health and hygiene were variable. Bottle feeding as we know it did not exist, so the risk of starvation or exposure to disease during infancy was high. Beyond the biological threats, children were exposed to numerous environmental hazards. Homes were crowded, often sharing space with animals, and open fires were used for cooking and heating, creating risks of burns or smoke inhalation. Streets were dirty and filled with waste, encouraging the spread of parasites and diseases. The harsh realities of medieval childhood extended beyond survival. Unlike the modern concept of a prolonged and protected childhood, medieval children were expected to contribute to the family's survival from a very young age. By the age of 7, many children were already working alongside their parents in the fields, tending animals or helping with household chores. This was not a choice, but a necessity. A family could not afford to have a child who did not pull their weight. Boys and girls often had different roles, shaped by rigid gender norms. Boys were trained early in the skills required for their future roles, farming, crafting, or learning trades. In noble families, boys might begin training as pages or squires, learning combat, horsemanship, and etiquette. For most common children, however, education was minimal or non-existent, with survival taking precedence. Girls, meanwhile, learned domestic skills such as cooking, spinning, weaving, and childcare. From early childhood, they were prepared for the roles of wife and mother, which were considered their primary destinies. Formal education for girls was rare, mostly limited to daughters of the wealthy or those entering convents, where reading and writing skills could be acquired. Many children did not enjoy playtime or leisure. While games and toys did exist, they were simple and often improvised. Children might play with wooden dolls, hobby horses, or balls, but these moments were brief and infrequent, overshadowed by the demands of work and survival. Education, where it existed, was heavily influenced by the church. Monasteries and cathedrals provided some schooling, primarily for boys destined for clerical careers. Reading, writing, Latin, and religious instruction formed the core curriculum. For the vast majority of children, however, literacy was unattainable, and learning was largely experiential, passed down through daily tasks and oral tradition. The social and economic structures of medieval England meant that children's futures were largely predetermined. Birth status heavily influenced their life paths. Noble children were groomed for leadership, land ownership, or religious roles, while peasant children were expected to continue the laborious cycle of agriculture and servitude. The concept of social mobility was limited, and education or opportunity rarely altered one's predetermined station. Childhood was also fraught with dangers from neglect or outright abuse. The absence of legal protections for children meant that their welfare depended entirely on their families. Physical punishment was a common method of discipline, accepted as necessary to teach obedience and skills. Child abandonment was not unknown, especially if a family was too poor to care for all their offspring, or if a child was born with disabilities. Infanticide, while condemned by the church, was nonetheless practiced in desperate circumstances. Religious beliefs deeply influenced perceptions of childhood. Children were seen as innocent, but also as inherently sinful from birth, a concept known as original sin. Baptism was critical for salvation, and delays in baptism could cause great anxiety for parents fearing for their child's soul. Childhood innocence was fleeting. Children were expected to grow quickly into moral, obedient adults. Despite the bleak statistics and harsh realities, medieval children showed resilience and adaptability. Many formed strong bonds within their families and communities. Festivals, religious celebrations, and communal events provided brief respite and joy. Stories, songs, and folk tales were passed down, enriching the social fabric and providing cultural continuity. In summary, growing up in medieval England was an arduous journey filled with peril and hardship. Most children faced an uncertain future from the moment they were born, battling disease, malnutrition, and environmental dangers. Work began early, and education was a luxury for the few. Social structures reinforced limited opportunities and harsh expectations. Understanding the realities of medieval childhood helps dispel romantic myths and highlights the extraordinary resilience of children who lived in a world vastly different from our own. Growing up in medieval England was far from the protected and playful experience many imagine. Instead, childhood was a precarious, often brutal phase of life that many never survived past. While today's children enjoy education, healthcare, and leisure, medieval children were thrown into a harsh world of disease, hunger, early labor, and relentless expectation, the grim reality of childhood mortality. One of the most shocking facts about medieval childhood is the staggering mortality rate. Scholars estimate that between 30 and 50% of children died before their fifth birthday. Many others never lived to see adulthood. The causes of this early death were numerous and terrifying. Infectious diseases were widespread and deadly in medieval England, with outbreaks of measles, smallpox, whooping cough, diphtheria, and the ever-present scourge of the plague taking countless young lives. Living conditions made the spread of these diseases almost inevitable. Towns and villages were cramped, unsanitary, and filthy. Human and animal waste were often dumped in the streets, contaminating the water supply. Open cesspits and the lack of proper sewage systems meant that infections and parasites thrived. Without understanding of germs or hygiene, people had no way to stop the spread of disease. Mothers and caregivers had little means to protect infants from sickness, and once a child became ill, the odds of recovery were slim. Nutrition played a crucial role in a child's survival chances. The diets of peasants, the vast majority of the population, were poor and repetitive. Bread made from coarse grains, watery pottage, and weak ale formed the staples. Protein sources such as meat and fish were rare luxuries. Malnourished children had weakened immune systems and were much more susceptible to infections. Even in wealthier households, where food variety was greater, diseases still ravaged children, though survival rates were somewhat higher. The harshness of daily life for children. For those fortunate enough to survive infancy, childhood brought immense hardships. Unlike the long, carefree childhoods modern society values, medieval children were expected to begin contributing to the household's survival as early as 7 years old. This was not out of choice, but out of necessity. Every hand was needed to help with farming, animal husbandry, and household chores. Boys typically learned the skills required for their future trades. This might mean working alongside their fathers in the fields, apprenticing with a craftsman, or preparing for a career in the church or military if they were from noble families. Girls were taught domestic skills such as cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and caring for younger siblings. Childhood labor was relentless and physically demanding. Children helped plant and harvest crops, tended to animals, collected firewood, and performed tasks like churning butter or washing clothes. The work often took place from dawn until dusk, with few breaks or leisure time. Play existed but was limited, often interrupted by the need to work or care for family members. The division of labor by gender was strict. Boys' work prepared them for public life, trades, or leadership, while girls' work prepared them for marriage and motherhood. Education was a luxury and mostly reserved for boys, especially in the upper classes. Reading, writing, and Latin studies occurred in monasteries or private tutors' homes, but were unavailable to most peasant children, who learned only what was necessary to survive. Physical punishment was a normal part of life. Discipline was harsh, with beatings from parents, masters, or teachers considered necessary to teach obedience and skills. This was accepted as part of a child's upbringing, though by modern standards it was brutal. Neglect and abandonment were tragic realities for some children. If a family could not support all its children, or if a child was disabled or sickly, abandonment or infanticide might occur despite religious condemnation. The church preached the sanctity of life, but understood the harshness of poverty that sometimes forced such desperate acts. Social expectations and life paths. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical. Children were born into a social class that largely determined their future. Noble children were groomed for leadership, landholding, or ecclesiastical roles, with formal education and training. Peasant children, on the other hand, had few opportunities for advancement and were expected to continue their family's labor-intensive lifestyle. Marriage and family life were central to children's futures. Girls were often betrothed young and married in their early teens, expected to bear children and manage households. Childbirth was dangerous and contributed to the high mortality rates among women. Boys married later, often after establishing themselves economically. Religious influence on childhood. Religion deeply influenced medieval views on childhood. Children were seen as born with original sin and needed baptism soon after birth to save their souls. Delayed baptism was a source of anxiety for parents fearing the spiritual fate of their infants. The church also provided some support through charity and education, especially for orphaned or poor children. Monastic schools were some of the few places where literacy could be learned. Religious festivals and rites marked childhood milestones and provided moments of communal celebration. Play, culture, and resilience. Despite the hardships, children found ways to enjoy themselves. Games, simple toys, and storytelling were common. Wooden dolls, hobby horses, and balls were popular playthings. Songs, folk tales, and festivals enriched the cultural life of children and communities. Children's resilience in the face of adversity was remarkable. They adapted quickly to the demands of work and survival, often developing skills and toughness from a young age. Family and community bonds provided essential support, and children learned the values and traditions that would sustain them. Faith and fear, the church was always watching. Every part of life revolved around the church and the fear of hell. In medieval England, faith was not merely a private matter of belief or a comforting refuge. It was the very foundation of society, law, culture, and daily life. The church was omnipresent, exerting immense power and influence over every individual, from the highest noble to the poorest peasant. This was an age when the spiritual world was as real and immediate as the physical one, and the fear of eternal damnation, of hell, shaped people's behaviors, choices, and even their fears and hopes. To truly understand medieval England, one must understand how faith and fear, tightly intertwined, governed everything. The central role of the church in medieval life. From the moment a person was born until their death, the church marked and controlled key moments. Baptism was essential. Without it, the church taught, a soul was condemned to hell. This meant that newborn babies were baptized quickly, often within days or hours of birth, to ensure their salvation. Throughout life, people were expected to attend Mass regularly, observe religious holidays, confess their sins, and partake in sacraments such as communion and marriage. Even farming, trading, and political decisions were influenced by religious calendars and church teachings. The church was the largest landowner in England and wielded enormous economic power. Monasteries, cathedrals, and parish churches dotted the landscape, serving as spiritual centers and community hubs. The clergy were among the most educated people of the time, and they controlled the written word, which meant they dictated not only religious doctrine, but often laws and moral codes. The medieval world was a deeply religious one, where the church's moral authority was rarely questioned openly. The fear of hell, a powerful tool. One of the most effective ways the church maintained control was through the pervasive fear of hell. Medieval sermons often emphasized the horrors of eternal damnation, unquenchable fires, suffering, torment by demons, and complete separation from God's grace. Hell was portrayed as a real physical place, a terrifying afterlife punishment for sinners. This fearful image was etched into the medieval imagination by priests, monks, and artists alike. Paintings, stained glass windows, and illuminated manuscripts often featured graphic depictions of hell, complete with monstrous demons dragging souls into flames. This fear was not only spiritual, but practical. The church claimed authority over confession and absolution. Only through the church's mercy could a sinner hope for forgiveness and escape from hell. This gave the clergy enormous power to influence behavior and to collect tithes and penances. People genuinely believed that failure to follow church teachings and participate in sacraments could condemn them forever, which made religious conformity a social necessity as well as a spiritual duty. Daily life under church watch. The church's influence penetrated even the most mundane aspects of daily life. Medieval people lived according to the liturgical calendar, which dictated work, rest, and celebration. Sundays and numerous feast days were days of rest and worship, while certain days demanded fasting or abstinence from meat. Violating these rules was not only seen as sinful, but often punished by the church or secular authorities. Parish churches served as centers for community life. They were the places where baptisms, weddings, funerals, and mass took place, moments that shaped the rhythm of life. The local priest was a powerful figure, acting as a spiritual guide, a record keeper, and sometimes a judge. Confession was a private yet socially enforced ritual where individuals admitted sins and received penance. The confessional was a place of fear and hope. Sinning meant spiritual peril, but confession meant forgiveness. Church bells marked time, calling people to prayer multiple times a day. People prayed for protection, health, harvest success, and forgiveness. They believed in saints and relics that could intercede on their behalf. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common for those who could afford the journey, seen as acts that might reduce time in purgatory or ensure divine favor. The church and education. The church controlled education and literacy. Monasteries and cathedral schools were the only places where most learning occurred, and education was primarily for boys, especially those destined for the clergy or nobility. Reading and writing were taught mainly to study the Bible, Latin prayers, and religious texts. This monopoly on knowledge reinforced the church's authority. Those who could interpret scripture were clergy, while the laity remained largely illiterate and dependent on oral teachings. Heresy and the threat of excommunication. Not everyone accepted the church's teachings unquestioningly, but dissent was dangerous. The church aggressively fought heresy, beliefs or practices considered contrary to official doctrine. Being accused of heresy could lead to excommunication, which meant expulsion from the church community, and the denial of sacraments. Excommunication was terrifying because it endangered a person's soul and social standing, often resulting in ostracism or worse. In some cases, heretics were handed over to secular authorities for punishment, including imprisonment, torture, or execution. The fear of being branded a heretic kept many people silent and obedient. This was a powerful form of social control that reinforced the church's dominance. The role of religion in social hierarchy and politics. The church was intertwined with political power. Monarchs and nobles relied on the church's legitimacy, often claiming their right to rule was divinely sanctioned. Coronations were religious ceremonies, and bishops and abbots often held seats in the king's council or parliament. The church's teachings also reinforced the social order. The idea that the king ruled by divine right and that people should obey their earthly superiors was tied to religious doctrine. This discouraged rebellion and fostered acceptance of one's social station, no matter how harsh or unjust. Religious festivals, moments of joy and community. Despite the fear and strictures, religious festivals offered rare opportunities for celebration, music, dance, and community gathering. Events like Christmas, Easter, and All Saints' Day were marked by feasting, special church services, and sometimes carnivals. These festivals were a vital release from the hardship of daily life, reminding people of God's mercy and the hope of eternal life. Spiritual life and personal devotion. Beyond fear and social control, many medieval people experienced genuine personal faith and devotion. Prayer, pilgrimages, and acts of charity were ways to connect with God and seek salvation. Mystics, saints, and holy relics inspired hope and provided comfort. The church encouraged acts of penance and good works to reduce time in purgatory, the temporary place souls were believed to go to be purified before reaching heaven. Conclusion: the all-consuming power of faith and fear. In medieval England, faith was inseparable from daily life. The church's power was not just spiritual, but social, political, and economic. Its teachings shaped every action, governed every major life event, and instilled a profound fear of hell that controlled behavior. Yet amid this fear was genuine faith and hope, a complex mix of dread and devotion that defined an era. To live in medieval England was to live under the constant watch of the church, where salvation was the ultimate goal and hell the ultimate terror. Always at war, you might die by sword or starvation. Peasants could be conscripted, taxed to death, or caught in the path of war. Medieval England was a land perpetually shadowed by the threat of war. While we often romanticize knights in shining armor clashing on battlefields, the reality was far bleaker, especially for the common folk, the peasants and serfs who bore the heaviest burdens of conflict. War was not a rare event, but a recurring calamity that could erupt with devastating consequences, turning fertile fields into battlefields and peaceful villages into charnel houses. For most people, survival was never guaranteed, whether from the sword of an invading army, starvation caused by wartime disruption, or crushing taxes demanded to fund endless conflicts. From the Norman conquest in 1066 through to the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century, England was rarely free from military campaigns or internal strife. The early medieval period saw frequent battles between English kings and rival claimants, local rebellions, and invasions by foreign powers. The Plantagenet kings spent much of their reign trying to assert control over their lands in France, leading to the long and brutal Hundred Years' War. Meanwhile, the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York, devastated much of the country in the late medieval era. For peasants, these wars were less about honor and glory and more about loss and survival. Armies marched through the countryside, often living off the land, which meant seizing crops, livestock, and supplies by force. Villages were burned, homes destroyed, and people killed or taken as prisoners. There was little protection for common folk. Their only hope was the protection of their local lord, but even that was often unreliable. One of the most direct ways peasants were drawn into war was through conscription. Although medieval armies were largely composed of knights and men-at-arms, peasants were often pressed into service as foot soldiers or laborers. This was not a voluntary enlistment, but a forced obligation under the feudal system. Lords demanded that their tenants provide men for military campaigns, and failure to comply could lead to severe penalties. For the average peasant, being conscripted was a terrifying prospect. They were poorly equipped, often armed only with farming tools or crude weapons, and lacked any formal military training. On the battlefield, they faced professional soldiers, archers, and heavily armored knights, a deadly mismatch. Casualties among these conscripts were high, and returning home alive was never guaranteed. Moreover, conscription pulled men away from their fields during crucial planting or harvesting seasons, threatening their family's food supply. The absence of able-bodied workers could lead to missed crops and increased hardship at home, compounding the risks of war. War was expensive, and the crown needed money to pay soldiers, buy weapons, and maintain armies. To raise funds, medieval kings imposed heavy taxes on their subjects. For peasants already struggling to survive, these taxes could be ruinous. Taxes came in many forms: direct money payments, tithes to the church, or labor obligations. One particularly harsh form was the scutage, a tax paid by knights or landholders who chose not to serve in battle, allowing the king to hire mercenaries instead. While the wealthy might afford this, the cost was often passed down to peasants in increased rents or dues. During prolonged conflicts like the Hundred Years' War, taxation reached crushing levels. The crown imposed new taxes on everyday goods such as wool or grain, further raising the cost of living. Failure to pay taxes could lead to imprisonment or seizure of property, deepening the cycle of poverty. In some cases, desperate peasants revolted against taxation and the burden of war. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was sparked partly by outrage over new poll taxes and unfair treatment, illustrating how war-related financial strain could explode into social unrest. Perhaps the most devastating consequence of war for medieval peasants was famine. Armies on the move destroyed crops, uprooted fields, and trampled livestock, causing widespread food shortages. Peasants who survived battles often returned to find their homes burned and granaries emptied. Warfare also disrupted trade routes and markets, making it harder to obtain food or sell produce. Prices for basic necessities soared, putting food out of reach for many families. The interconnected nature of medieval agriculture meant that the failure of one harvest could lead to local or even regional famine. Starvation was not just a slow death, it weakened people's immune systems, making them vulnerable to disease, a deadly combination that could decimate entire communities. Those who survived had to endure the physical and psychological toll of hunger, often relying on charity from monasteries or the church for meager relief. For villages caught in the path of war, the experience was nightmarish. Sieges were common during medieval conflicts, where armies surrounded castles or towns, cutting off supplies and bombarding defenses. Civilians inside suffered from hunger, disease, and constant fear. Outside the walls, peasants were not safe either. Raiding armies looted, raped, and destroyed. Women and children were particularly vulnerable, often becoming victims of violence or being forced into servitude. The destruction of homes and farms left survivors homeless and destitute. Living with the constant threat of war took a heavy psychological toll. Fear, uncertainty, and grief were daily companions for medieval peasants. Families were torn apart as men went off to fight, many never returning. Communities faced the trauma of violence and loss with little support. The church offered some comfort, teaching that suffering in this life might lead to salvation in the next. But this spiritual solace did not erase the very real pain and hardship endured by millions. While peasants suffered the worst effects of war, the nobility and knights viewed warfare as a duty and a path to honor and wealth. Knights trained from childhood to fight and uphold chivalric ideals, though reality often fell short of the romantic image. Lords led their armies into battle, seeking to expand territories, defend claims, or enforce royal authority. However, even among nobles, war was costly and dangerous. Many died in battle or from wounds and disease afterward. The constant warfare also drained noble resources and led to political instability. One of the longest and most devastating conflicts was the Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France. This war saw repeated invasions, battles, and shifting fortunes. Peasants were conscripted, lands were ravaged, and economies strained. This war also saw the rise of new military tactics and weapons such as the English longbow, which changed the face of medieval warfare. But for ordinary people, the war meant years of hardship, destruction, and uncertainty. To live in medieval England was to live in a world where war was never far away. For peasants, war brought conscription, crushing taxes, destruction, starvation, and death. It was a brutal reality that shaped every aspect of life and left scars on the land and its people. Your house is a hut, cold, cramped, and crumbling. Wattle and daub walls, smoky air, and one room shared with animals. Forget whatever you picture when you think of the word home. In medieval England, the average person didn't return from the fields to a cozy cottage with thick walls and a fireplace. Instead, most people lived in cramped primitive dwellings made of mud, straw, and timber. These huts were often constructed using a method called wattle and daub, where woven wooden strips, wattle, formed the frame, and a mixture of mud, straw, dung, and club filled in the gaps. This wasn't an architectural choice so much as a matter of survival. It was the cheapest, most readily available building method for the peasantry. These homes were incredibly small by modern standards. Imagine a single room, no larger than a modern studio apartment, with a dirt floor and no internal divisions. That was it. The whole family, parents, children, and possibly grandparents, all slept in the same space. Privacy did not exist. At night, people bundled together under coarse wool blankets or animal skins, doing their best to stay warm during the bitter English winters. There was no insulation. The walls offered little protection from wind, cold, or rain. Roofs were made of thatch, bundles of straw tied tightly and layered over a wooden frame. Thatched roofs were surprisingly effective at shedding water, but also incredibly flammable and prone to hosting infestations of mice, birds, and insects. In colder seasons, the wind could sneak through cracks in the walls, and snow sometimes blew in through the door, which was often just a piece of wood lashed in place. The hearth was the center of the home, both symbolically and practically. It was the only source of heat and light and was used for cooking and boiling water, when water was available and not too contaminated. But there was no chimney. Smoke from the fire rose and hovered in the air before slowly escaping through a hole in the roof or the door. As a result, the interiors of medieval huts were perpetually smoky. Living in that environment meant constant coughing, that stinging eyes, and lungs filled with soot. The ceiling beams and thatch would blacken with years of smoke. Visitors from modern times would choke within minutes. Animals often lived under the same roof. Chickens, pigs, or even a cow might sleep inside the house at night, not out of affection, but out of necessity. A pig was a family's most valuable possession, and leaving it outside could mean losing it to theft or wolves. The animals added body heat in winter, but also brought fleas, lice, and disease into the home. Their droppings were swept out in the morning, if at all. Sanitation was not a concept people lived by. It was a luxury of the future. There was no running water, of course. Families fetched water from a nearby stream or communal well, both of which were frequently contaminated. That water was stored in wooden buckets or earthenware pots inside the house. In some places, the nearest clean water might be a mile away. And forget about indoor toilets. People used chamber pots or simply squatted in a nearby field. Human waste was often tossed into open cesspits or just outside the home. The smell was ever present. Furniture was sparse and rudimentary. A few wooden stools or benches, maybe a rough table if the family was lucky. Beds were straw-stuffed sacks or just straw spread out on the floor. Sometimes people slept on raised wooden platforms to avoid the cold ground, but many families couldn't afford even that. In wealthier households, by medieval standards, there might be a curtained bed frame or a single feather mattress, luxuries unimaginable to most. Light came from the fire or from tallow candles, thick, foul-smelling things made from animal fat. They produced a dim, flickering light and filled the room with an acrid odor. Windows were rare in peasant homes, and when they did exist, they were simple holes in the wall, covered by shutters or oiled cloth, which offered little insulation. During storms or heavy rains, water could seep in through the walls or roof. Families huddled together in damp clothing, praying that the thatch held. In particularly harsh winters, people froze to death in their own homes. Wood was hard to come by. Most forests were owned by the nobility, and gathering firewood could be punished as theft. Peasants burned what they could, dried dung, sticks, thatched scraps, or even furniture. Personal belongings were few. Clothing, passed down and patched, was hung on pegs or folded in corners. Tools and cooking implements were stored along the walls. A few pewter or wooden bowls, a pot for boiling, and maybe a knife were the extent of most families' kitchenware. Every item had to serve multiple purposes. Despite the harshness of their conditions, medieval peasants did what they could to make these huts feel like homes. Herbs hung from the rafters for drying, often doubling as insect repellents. Symbols of faith, crosses, charms, or simple painted icons might adorn a wall or shelf. Families gathered around the fire at night, telling stories, singing, or simply enduring the cold together in silence. Seasonal rhythms defined the hut's atmosphere. In summer, doors were left open for air, and families might sleep outside under trees. In winter, every effort was made to keep warmth in and danger out. Flooding was common, especially in low-lying areas. Some huts were built on slight rises to avoid water pooling around the home, but others weren't so lucky. Rain could destroy a poorly maintained wall overnight. For peasants, there was no sense of architectural permanence. These huts were not built to last for generations. If a house collapsed, was burned in war, or crumbled from disrepair, it was simply rebuilt using the same materials. Villages were clusters of such homes, muddy paths between them, livestock wandering freely, and smoke rising from every roof. This was daily life. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't cozy, it was survival in its most raw form. Children grew up coughing in the smoke, sleeping beside animals, and waking before dawn to start another day of labor. Their parents did the same until they died, often by age 30 or 40. No matter how often modern depictions paint medieval villages as quaint or charming, the reality was far grimmer. And yet people endured. Through disease, war, famine, and the unforgiving elements, they lived in these huts. They raised families, told stories, carved spoons, baked bread, and marked time by the passing of seasons. In these tiny, smoky, shivering spaces, life persisted, even thrived in its own brutal way. That was medieval England, not a world of stone castles and knights on horseback, but of dirt-floored huts filled with smoke and struggle. You smell awful, clothing, bathing, and social odors. Unwashed wool, no deodorant, and community stench, everyone reeked. When you step into the world of medieval England, you're immediately hit with something no drawing, film, or reenactment can fully convey: the overwhelming stench. It was inescapable. The scent of humanity in its most unwashed, fermented state clung to every alley, market, and manor. No one, not even the nobility, truly smelled fresh. This wasn't due to laziness or indifference, but rather a complete lack of modern sanitation, personal hygiene, and cultural emphasis on cleanliness. The average medieval person wore the same clothing for days, sometimes weeks, without washing it. Their outer garments, typically made of heavy wool or linen, absorbed sweat, cooking smoke, and the natural body odors produced from hard physical labor. And since most people only owned 1 or 2 sets of clothes at most, there was no rotation system to rely on. Clothes were laboriously hand-stitched and expensive to make, so they were worn until they practically fell apart. Bathing, as we understand it, was rare. While public bathhouses had once been popular in early medieval times, by the later Middle Ages, these establishments were increasingly viewed with suspicion. Concerns over morality, sexuality, And disease meant that many people began to avoid communal baths, and private ones were only available to the wealthy. Most common folk made do with occasional sponge baths in cold basins, or perhaps a quick rinse in a stream during warmer months. Even when people did bathe, soap as we know it wasn't always available. Basic lye soap, which was often harsh and irritating, was used when it could be afforded. Its pungent smell didn't necessarily help improve matters. It was just another odor added to the medieval mix. Some wealthier individuals might have used herbal concoctions or perfumed oils to mask the smell, but for most, these luxuries were far out of reach. There was no such thing as deodorant. Instead, people might carry posies of herbs or scented cloths to wave under their noses when the smell of the streets became unbearable. In church, nobles often brought pomanders, small balls filled with fragrant spices, to avoid the unpleasantness of standing shoulder to shoulder with unwashed bodies. Even monks and nuns, who lived highly regimented and disciplined lives, rarely bathed more than a few times a year. Underclothes were often nothing more than a simple linen shift or shirt. These items, being in direct contact with the skin, absorbed the bulk of bodily sweat and grime. Washing these was slightly more common, but still not frequent. Lacking running water and laundry machines, washing involved hauling buckets from a well, scrubbing garments with abrasive tools, and drying them under the sun, an all-day effort. The medieval diet also contributed to the body odor problem. Heavy on onions, garlic, salted meat, and fermented foods, people's natural scent was intensified. Combine that with a lack of dental hygiene, and you get a general aroma of decaying teeth, bad breath, and sour sweat. Since everyone smelled more or less the same, people simply got used to it. Communal life made matters worse. Most peasants lived in small, one-room homes with thatched roofs and wattle and daub walls. These huts were shared with livestock during the cold months, which added the constant smell of manure, wet fur, and hay to the human stench. There were no separate bedrooms, no indoor toilets, just a bucket or a pit outside. Everything, cooking, eating, sleeping, birthing, dying, happened in that one room, and it all left its mark on the air. In towns and cities, the smell was even more intense. Streets doubled as open sewers, with chamber pots being emptied directly onto the roads. Rotting food, animal carcasses, and waste piled up in corners. Butchers worked in open stalls, blood running through the gutters. Tanners boiled urine to cure hides. Dyers used fermented human waste in their vats. The smell wasn't a momentary inconvenience. It was the permanent backdrop of life. Efforts were made to combat the smell, especially in religious or royal households. Herbs like lavender, rosemary, and thyme were scattered on floors to provide a more pleasant scent when stepped on. Cathedrals burned incense not just for spiritual symbolism, but also to overpower the stench of the congregation. Castles might have perfumed tapestries or scented candles, though these did little against the persistent rot of the moat or the kitchens. Interestingly, attitudes towards smell were different than today. Medieval people associated scent with health and morality. A pleasant smell was believed to indicate virtue and divine favor, while foul smells were thought to spread disease or signal sin. This belief partially explains the fear of bathing. Opening up the pores was thought to make one vulnerable to bad air, or miasma, which was believed to be the cause of illness. Despite the overwhelming presence of odor, cleanliness wasn't entirely ignored. Religious washing rituals before prayer, foot washing ceremonies, and symbolic purification practices existed. Wealthier households might have had servants to help them clean up with warm cloths or assist in bathing on special occasions. But for the vast majority, the resources simply weren't available. In the rare instance that someone did take a proper bath, it was a complex affair. Water had to be fetched, heated over a fire, poured into a wooden tub, and then reused by the rest of the family in order of importance. By the time the youngest child got in, the water was lukewarm and murky. In winter, bathing could be dangerous. Cold homes and damp bodies led to illness. For many, it simply wasn't worth the risk. So when you picture life in medieval England, forget the idealized knights in shining armor or noblewomen in embroidered gowns. Think instead of scratchy wool, sour underarms, dung in the streets, and the inescapable stink of a world without plumbing, perfumes, or privacy. In a society where scent was both feared and tolerated, everyone walked through life with their nose half turned away until the next whiff reminded them that this was, indeed, the aroma of the age. From dawn to dusk, endless labor with no weekend. Agricultural life meant unceasing work, dictated by daylight and the seasons. When you open your eyes in a small wooden hut in the heart of medieval England, there's no gentle alarm clock or weekend lie-in awaiting you. Instead, your day begins with the crow of a rooster, if you're lucky enough to even have one. More often, the call to consciousness is the chill of damp air and the grumbles of an empty stomach. You rise before the sun, and you'll work until long after it has set. There are no weekends, no holidays except for a handful of church feast days, and absolutely no time for leisure. Life is toil, ceaseless, grinding, and often unrewarded. Most medieval English people lived in rural communities and were part of the agrarian economy. Nearly 90% of the population were peasants who worked on farms owned by lords under the feudal system. Their existence was governed not by personal ambition or innovation, but by obligation. These people were either villeins, unfree peasants, bordars, smallholders, or cottars, laborers with a bit of land, and they owed labor, taxes, and loyalty to their lord in exchange for the privilege of working their small strips of land. Whether plowing fields, shearing sheep, collecting firewood, or mending fences, their days were determined by the demands of the land and the changing seasons. Each day began at first light, with work commencing around sunrise. Spring meant plowing and sowing seeds, summer was harvest time, autumn brought threshing and storing grains, and winter was devoted to repairing tools and caring for animals. The rhythm of nature provided no time off. Even religious feast days often meant extra work, church attendance, special meals, and community obligations rather than true rest. For the peasantry, every hour of daylight had to be used productively or risk starvation. The work itself was physically brutal. Men and women alike labored in the fields, bending and lifting for hours on end with primitive tools, mostly wooden implements and iron-tipped plows drawn by oxen. In many cases, these tools were shared, meaning that time in the fields had to be carefully managed or extended into the darker hours. The soil was hard, the weather often unforgiving. Wet seasons could rot crops, while droughts led to withering yields. A bad harvest could be the difference between subsistence and famine. Even good years demanded tireless effort to gather hay, winnow grain, and haul produce to storage. Women's work was equally unending and often more varied. In addition to sharing in field labor, they tended to children, managed the household, spun wool, brewed ale, made butter and cheese, cooked meals over smoky hearths, fetched water from wells or streams, and cleaned what little they had. Their tasks weren't divided by gender in the way we understand modern roles. Survival trumped social customs. If a task needed doing, whoever was available did it. There was no such thing as a weekend. The modern concept of Saturday and Sunday leisure didn't exist. Sunday was technically a rest day in the eyes of the church, but even then, many had to tend to animals or urgent chores. The nearest they came to a day off might be a saint's feast day, which offered a chance to gather for religious observance and perhaps a communal meal or celebration. But those days were exceptions, not expectations, and they still involved cooking, walking long distances to the parish church, and observing religious customs. Children were not exempt from this relentless labor. By the age of 6 or 7, most children began contributing in earnest to household and field duties. They might scare birds from crops, gather firewood, help with spinning or weaving, or serve as shepherds. Formal education was a luxury few could afford or access. Instead, children learned their tasks by doing, directly from parents or older siblings, day in and day out. Work rarely ended when the sun set. With no electric lights, peasants relied on rushlights or candles, which were expensive and short-lived. Most evening hours were spent doing quieter tasks, mending clothes, carving tools, or preparing food for the next day. It was also a time for prayer, storytelling, or community gathering if energy allowed. But more often than not, fatigue led to early bedtimes, perhaps 8 or 9 p.m., with entire families curling up on straw-stuffed mattresses on the dirt floor of their homes. Seasonal labor added another layer of difficulty. In summer, days could stretch to 14 hours of sunlight, all of which were expected to be used efficiently. In winter, although there were fewer hours of light, the chores were no less demanding. Animal care, mending fences, chopping wood, and preserving food took precedence. Bad weather didn't stop the work. Rain or snow simply made it more dangerous and miserable. Beyond physical labor, medieval peasants also owed a certain number of days per year working their lord's land, often without compensation. This could include everything from harvesting crops to maintaining roads or fences. These labor dues were not optional, and refusal could result in fines, corporal punishment, or worse. Many families balanced this feudal obligation with tending their own meager plots of land, often leading to 16-hour workdays during peak seasons. And yet, despite the backbreaking routine, the medieval peasantry endured. They developed systems of mutual aid, neighbors helping neighbors during harvest or illness. Community bonds were strong, not out of sentimentality, but necessity. Everyone knew that one missed day of work, one broken plow, or one poor harvest could be devastating. In these rural villages, labor wasn't just a burden, it was the binding force of life. In the rare event of a local fair or celebration, peasants might enjoy a brief respite, a dance, a shared jug of ale, or a bit of entertainment. But these moments were fleeting and surrounded by toil. Even marriage or childbirth was followed quickly by a return to duty. Life didn't pause for joy, nor did it accommodate grief. The concept of retirement was non-existent. A peasant worked until they could no longer stand, until illness or injury made it impossible. There was no pension, no savings account, just the hope that one's children might be strong enough to carry the burden forward. And many didn't make it that far. Life expectancy for a medieval laborer rarely exceeded 40 years. From dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, the life of a medieval peasant in England was a relentless cycle of labor, necessity, and survival. There was no pause button, no holidays abroad, no rest from the grind. Just the land, the weather, and the ever-present demands of staying alive in a world that never stopped asking more of you. Little workers in training, from the cradle to the fields, kids became laborers or servants almost immediately. In medieval England, childhood as we understand it today was virtually non-existent. The concept of a carefree, protected phase of life filled with play and education simply didn't exist for the vast majority of children. Instead, from the moment they could walk and talk, children were viewed as small adults, miniature laborers who were expected to contribute to the survival and productivity of their household or the lord's estate. Their journey into adulthood began shockingly early, often before they had the chance to form lasting memories, and was shaped by hardship, work, and, all too often, premature death. The life of a child in a peasant family was defined by necessity. In most cases, their parents were serfs or smallholders, families tied to the land, working it for a feudal lord in exchange for the right to survive. Every pair of hands mattered. As soon as a child was able to walk steadily and follow instructions, they were assigned tasks: watching over younger siblings, helping in the garden, collecting firewood, tending animals, fetching water from the nearest well or stream, and even scaring birds away from crops. There was no option to be idle. Labor began early, and it continued every day, sunrise to sunset, with few breaks and no real concept of leisure. For many children, work began in earnest by the age of 7, a milestone that marked a transition from early childhood to a more formal role in the household economy. A boy might be apprenticed to a tradesman or farmer, and a girl might be sent into domestic service, often within the home of a wealthier family or at a manor. In either case, it meant separation from their family and immersion in an environment where expectations were adult-sized. Discipline was strict, punishments were harsh, and expectations were high. Mistakes, particularly those involving food, animals, or tools, could carry real consequences. Those fortunate enough to be born into merchant or noble families had a very different experience. For them, childhood could include education, learning courtly manners, or being groomed for religious life. Boys might study Latin, arithmetic, or rhetoric under a tutor, often in preparation for a career in the church or at court. Girls were taught how to manage a household, spin, embroider, and oversee servants, skills essential for marriage and managing estates. Still, even in these privileged circles, childhood was not sheltered. By their early teens, noble children were expected to marry, lead, or serve. One of the few reprieves for medieval children came during festivals and holy days. There were numerous religious observances throughout the year: Christmas, Easter, Midsummer, and Saints' feast days that occasionally allowed for a suspension of labor. On these rare occasions, children might participate in games, singing, or religious pageantry. However, the reprieve was temporary and, for many, barely perceptible beneath the weight of everyday obligations. Perhaps the most grueling reality of medieval childhood was the ever-present threat of disease and death. Infant mortality rates were high, with nearly half of all children dying before the age of 5. A combination of poor hygiene, lack of medical knowledge, unsanitary living conditions, and malnutrition created an unforgiving environment. Parents often gave their children the same name as a deceased sibling, a practice so common it became a kind of grim insurance policy against the overwhelming odds of loss. Emotional bonds between parents and their young children were sometimes restrained by necessity. It wasn't uncommon for mothers to avoid naming their infants until they survived their first few months. Baptism was usually performed within days of birth, not only for religious reasons, but also to ensure the child's soul wouldn't be lost to limbo should they die suddenly. Another avenue for young children, particularly boys from lower nobility, was military training. From around the age of 7, a child might be sent to another noble household to serve as a page. This wasn't merely about honor or status. It was a rigorous, often brutal introduction to the martial world. Pages ran errands, learned horsemanship, swordsmanship, and etiquette. They bore witness to the violent realities of knightly life, from battlefield wounds to the enforcement of feudal justice. If they survived and excelled, they might eventually become squires, and by their early 20s, knights. Girls, on the other hand, faced the dual pressure of domestic labor and reproductive expectations. By their early teens, girls were often married, sometimes to much older men. These marriages were arranged, and the primary objective was the continuation of bloodlines or the solidification of alliances. Childbearing began early and often with dangerous consequences. The risks of childbirth were immense, and many young women died during their first or second pregnancies, cementing the tragic reality that girlhood ended early and often fatally. Education for most children was non-existent. Literacy was a rare skill, and schools, when they did exist, were generally attached to monasteries or cathedrals and restricted to boys of high status or those destined for the clergy. Even the ability to sign one's name was a privilege, not a right. Most children grew up entirely illiterate, speaking only their local dialect and understanding only the fragments of Latin chanted during Mass. Their world was profoundly local, defined by their village, their fields, and the routines passed down by generations. The emotional toll of such a childhood is difficult to measure, but historical records and oral traditions hint at both resilience and resignation. There are stories of laughter and companionship, of village games and shared songs. But these were brief moments of light in an otherwise grinding existence. Children bonded over chores and work, learning early how to navigate the harsh expectations of their society. They formed tight sibling bonds and relationships with animals, even as their adult responsibilities loomed constantly over them. To modern eyes, the medieval approach to childhood seems brutally utilitarian. It was a system rooted in survival, one in which sentimentality had little room. Childhood wasn't seen as a separate stage of life, but as a preparatory phase for adulthood, one that could be snuffed out by disease, war, or hunger without warning. Today, we view childhood as a sacred space, a time for growth, imagination, and learning. But in medieval England, it was a race against the clock. If a child survived long enough, they became a worker, a servant, a wife, or a soldier. If not, their short life was another quiet tragedy, buried and quickly replaced in a world where every life had a function. The idea of protecting childhood as a precious, unique phase of life is a relatively recent one, something unthinkable to the families toiling under the feudal sun. This was the reality of being born in medieval England, a childhood not of wonder, but of work. It was a time when innocence was brief, play was a luxury, and growing up wasn't just inevitable, it was immediate. Let me know if you want this formatted differently, or if you'd like me to assist with anything else. Market day misery, trade theft, and rotten turnips. The clang of iron hinges creaking open before dawn signaled the start of market day in a typical medieval English town. For many, this was the only chance in the week to sell goods, stock up on provisions, or catch up on gossip. The air was thick with smoke from cook fires, the stink of livestock, and the pungent tang of unwashed bodies. Merchants shouted over one another, barking out prices for salted fish, damp wool, and onions that had seen better weeks. Town criers bellowed out the latest proclamations and penalties, usually met with grumbling or the occasional rotting cabbage. Market days weren't glamorous, they were barely tolerable. Farmers trudged into town before sunrise, hauling carts of leeks, turnips, or cabbages often bruised from the journey. Many villagers couldn't read, so haggling was verbal and often aggressive. Buyers inspected goods with suspicion, always wary of being cheated. Sellers, for their part, sometimes painted rotting produce or meat with a bit of ash to make it appear fresher, a trick well known but difficult to prove without a good nose. One common market scam involved watered-down ale and wine. Taverns and stalls alike would sell brews that had been diluted several times over, or worse, steeped with herbs to mask spoilage. In some cases, unscrupulous brewers used ingredients that were outright dangerous, like poppy seeds or belladonna, leading to mysterious illnesses or hallucinations. Authorities sometimes tested the strength of ale by soaking a piece of cloth in it. If the cloth stiffened, the brew was acceptable. If not, the brewer could be fined, beaten, or thrown in the stocks. Thieves were everywhere. Pockets and purses were tempting targets in the noisy, chaotic crowd. Children were taught to keep a hand on their belongings, and women often hid their coin pouches under layers of clothing. Pickpockets worked in teams, one distracting while the other lifted the goods. Punishments for theft were harsh. If caught, a thief might lose a hand, be branded on the face, or publicly flogged. But many took the risk, especially during famine years when hunger outweighed fear. Animals were another hazard. Chickens squawked underfoot. Pigs wandered freely, sometimes darting between legs and causing unsuspecting shoppers to stumble into baskets of produce. Dogs scavenged the alleys, occasionally fighting over scraps and startling horses. Market towns had butchers and fishmongers in narrow lanes where blood and fish scales ran in rivulets down gutters, attracting flies and stench in equal measure. There were no garbage services. Waste simply accumulated until rain or pigs took it away. Bartering was common, especially among those who had little coin. A bucket of eggs might be traded for a patch of wool or a few loaves of bread. But this system required mutual trust and constant vigilance. Goods could be switched when eyes were turned. Scales were sometimes tampered with. Vendors weighted them with stones hidden beneath the table. Markets were supposed to be regulated by town authorities, but corruption and bribery meant the rules often applied selectively. Entertainment at the market was a double-edged sword. Minstrels sang bawdy tunes and acrobats performed daring stunts, but so did executioners and town constables. Onlookers could witness a thief being flogged, a woman punished for gossip, or a man placed in the pillory for cheating customers. Children watched with wide eyes. Humiliation was considered a moral teacher, and market day was the prime venue for public correction. Merchants from distant regions, or even other countries, brought spices, textiles, and oddities to market, but they weren't always welcomed. Foreigners, especially those who didn't speak the language, were treated with suspicion. Some towns imposed extra taxes on outsider traders or required them to work through local guilds. Jewish merchants, in particular, were often barred or heavily restricted, and could be accused of sorcery or dishonesty with little evidence. Anti-Semitic laws and sentiment were rampant. Seasonal fairs were even more chaotic. Larger than regular market days, these events brought in thousands from surrounding villages. Tents sprouted like mushrooms around town walls. Gambling, drinking, and bawdy performances became widespread, and crime spiked accordingly. It wasn't unusual for a festival day to end with broken bones, missing purses, and burned stalls. The church preached against such excesses, but even the local priests bought spices and ink at the fairs. Sanitation remained a major concern. Vendors sometimes used the same knife for butchering pigs and slicing cheese. There was no refrigeration, so meat hung in the open, flies swarming thick. Fresh milk turned quickly, and bread, often full of weevils or dust, grew stale by midday. Rats darted between stalls, thriving on dropped crumbs and refuse. Children often fell ill after market day, likely from exposure to spoiled food or infected water. Despite all this, market day was indispensable. It was the only time most people could access things like salt, iron tools, or news from other towns. It was where marriages were arranged, disputes settled, and alliances formed. A chance to catch the eye of a potential spouse, or trade gossip about who had been hauled before the manorial court. Some brought petitions for the local lord or bishop, hoping to win favor or lessen a tax burden. The market was also a place of resilience. Amid the grime and risk, people found ways to survive, to thrive even. Clever vendors became wealthy. Poor farmers managed to earn enough for shoes or candles. A child might receive a bit of candy or see a puppet show for the first time. Underneath the grit, the market pulsed with life. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, the marketplace offered fleeting glimpses of human connection, for better or worse. So while it's tempting to romanticize a medieval English market as quaint or colorful, the reality was far messier. Noise, stink, danger, and desperation defined the experience. It was a mirror of medieval society itself, divided, chaotic, and determined to keep going, one rotten turnip at a time. If you think modern taxes are frustrating, consider life in medieval England, where nearly every coin, crop, or chicken you managed to scrape together was destined to line someone else's pocket. Life for the average peasant, most of whom were serfs bound to the land, was a constant struggle to survive under an endless loop of obligations. You didn't just owe your labor to the lord of the manor, you also owed allegiance to the church, which came with its own unique price, the tithe. The tithe was a religious obligation, a tax in all but name, requiring you to give 1/10 of all your produce to the church. This wasn't just your crops, mind you. If you kept bees, the honey counted. If you raised livestock, the offspring of your animals counted. You had to part with 1/10 of whatever you earned or produced, even in the most meager of years. And you couldn't pay in money unless you were incredibly fortunate. Most peasants paid in kind, bushels of grain, eggs, wool, and anything else they had. This system added a heavy burden to people who were already starving. Imagine a poor harvest year when you were barely able to feed your own family. You still had to give 10% of your pitiful yield to the church, even if it meant going hungry. Failure to comply could mean excommunication, a spiritual punishment that, in the deeply religious worldview of the time, might as well have been a death sentence. People feared being cast out of the church even more than they feared physical punishment. Eternal damnation loomed large in the medieval imagination. And if the tithe weren't enough, you had the manorial obligations. The lord of the manor was entitled to your labor, and not just during harvest season. You worked his fields several days a week without pay, repaired his fences, maintained his roads, and even provided food and services when he traveled. If you wanted to use the Lord's mill to grind your grain, which you did, because there was often no alternative, you paid a fee. If you wanted to bake your bread in the communal oven, there was a charge. You even had to pay to graze your animals on common land. Then came the royal taxes. Though kings rarely interacted with peasants directly, they certainly demanded their due. Taxes could be levied for wars, for royal marriages, for crusades, and more. The king's agents would ride into villages and tally up households for collection. These taxes were often arbitrary and ruinous. The poll tax of 1381, for example, demanded that every adult, rich or poor, pay the same amount, which disproportionately crushed the lower classes. The outrage this caused eventually helped spark the peasants' revolt. Speaking of revolt, the financial pressure on peasants was one of the major factors behind uprisings. People weren't just angry at their lords or at the king. They were overwhelmed by a system that ensured they would never get ahead. If you managed to save a little, bad weather could ruin your crops, disease could wipe out your livestock, and raiders or soldiers could steal what little you had. And yet the church and the manor still expected their cut. Money itself was a rarity. Most peasants lived entirely in a barter economy, exchanging goods and labor rather than currency. When taxes had to be paid in coin, it often forced peasants to sell precious items or take on debt. Wealth, when it existed, was concentrated in the hands of the church and nobility. The clergy, ironically, were often among the wealthiest landowners. While preaching poverty and humility, many bishops and abbots lived in splendor, funded by the relentless flow of tithes. Even special events came with a cost. Marrying required permission from the Lord and a fee. Inheriting land? Another fee. Having your son enter the church or your daughter join a convent? Fees again. And upon death, the best animal or another valuable item from your estate, the Harriet, was surrendered to the Lord. You couldn't even die without paying. What made the situation even more crushing was the lack of upward mobility. There was no dream of becoming rich or free. You were born into your station, and that's where you stayed. Even if you were industrious and lucky, the constant demands from the church and Lord made it nearly impossible to build wealth. If you saved a few extra bushels of wheat, someone would come knocking, either to take it, tax it, or claim it in the name of God. And all this happened under the heavy hand of religion. People didn't question the tithe or the authority of the church because doing so was considered heresy. Heretics were exiled, tortured, or burned at the stake. The church justified its taxes by promising salvation and wielding the fear of hell like a weapon. Every Sunday, villagers heard sermons warning them that stinginess with God's share could doom their souls. Despite all this, there was little organized resistance for centuries. The social structure was so rigid and the fear so great that most people simply endured. It wasn't until pressures like the Black Death, inflation, and growing social awareness shook the foundations that major revolts began to occur. But for most of the medieval period, the peasant's lot remained the same. Work endlessly, give up a huge portion of what you produced, and pray that next year might be kinder. In modern terms, imagine working a job where 90% of your salary is automatically deducted. Then imagine being billed for using your company's bathroom, drinking water, or walking through the front door. Now imagine being told that this arrangement is holy and that questioning it might lead to your eternal torment. That's the kind of financial and psychological prison the average medieval English peasant lived in. So while modern tax season might feel burdensome, at least you're not paying in chickens and wool. And at least you can choose your job, keep your earnings, and question the system without being burned at the stake. In medieval England, every harvest was a gamble. Every penny was someone else's, and even heaven came with a price tag. Let me know if you'd like this formatted for publication, turned into a pod. Travel is terrifying. Bandits, mud, and no maps. Leaving your village meant risking robbery, getting lost, or worse. In medieval England, the very idea of leaving your home village could be enough to fill you with dread. Most people never strayed more than a few miles from where they were born, and for good reason. Travel during this era wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous, grueling, and sometimes fatal. Roads were little more than muddy tracks worn into the ground by carts and the hooves of livestock. Even calling them roads might have been generous. In the rainy months, which were most of them, they were bogs. In the summer, they turned to dust and ruts. The infrastructure was virtually non-existent, and maintenance depended on local lords, who had other priorities, like defending their land or collecting taxes. For the peasant class, travel was rarely voluntary. You might journey to a nearby town for market day, or make a pilgrimage to a shrine, but you'd never casually go on holiday. Every trip was a risk calculation. Bandits were a constant threat. With no standing police force, law enforcement was limited to whatever a local lord could muster, and those guards were more concerned with protecting their master's property than random travelers. Robbers knew this, and they operated freely along the roads, hiding in wooded areas and waiting for lonely travelers to ambush. If you were carrying goods or even just wore a cloak that looked nicer than rags, you became a target. There were no safe rest stops, no inns with warm fires and clean beds, just uncertainty and the looming threat of violence. If bandits didn't get you, nature might. Weather was another unrelenting foe. With no weather forecasts, you had to rely on the sky and superstition to decide if travel was safe. Sudden downpours could turn a passable road into a swamp. Flooding could wash away bridges, assuming there was a bridge to begin with. Rivers and streams, which you were often forced to ford, became deadly obstacles. There were no street signs, no directional arrows, and certainly no GPS. Maps, if they existed, were hand-drawn, inaccurate, and hoarded by the wealthy or clergy. Most peasants couldn't read, so even possessing a map wouldn't have helped. Travelers relied on oral directions, often vague and dependent on landmarks that might not exist anymore. Turn left at the big oak doesn't help if someone chopped it down for firewood. Beyond that, there was the threat of disease. Traveling exposed you to new people, new places, and with them, new germs. At a time when understanding of hygiene and infection was virtually non-existent, even a minor illness picked up from another village could be fatal. Stranger communities were often suspicious of outsiders and might deny you entry or assistance, fearing you carried plague or worse. Hospitality was a religious and cultural virtue, but fear could override kindness. If you showed up coughing, you might find doors slammed shut rather than welcoming. For the few who traveled frequently, merchants, pilgrims, and messengers, there was a certain rhythm to navigating these perils. They traveled in groups for protection, shared stories of safe paths, and carried letters of passage when possible. But even this didn't guarantee safety. A horse or cart breaking down in the middle of nowhere could leave you stranded for days. In winter, exposure was deadly. With no insulated boots, waterproof coats, or reliable shelter, hypothermia claimed more lives than you'd expect. Food was another problem. You couldn't stop at a roadside tavern and order stew. You brought what you could carry and hoped to hunt or beg if the journey dragged on. And potable water was almost non-existent. You drank what you could find, streams, ponds, even puddles, often at great risk of illness. Pilgrimages were a rare exception to this grim routine. The church encouraged these spiritual journeys, offering indulgences, a kind of spiritual credit, to those who made the trek to holy sites like Canterbury or Walsingham. These pilgrims might travel with official blessings or even under armed escort if they were wealthy, but for the average peasant, it was still a test of faith and endurance. Stories abound of pilgrims dying on the road, either from illness or robbery, their remains buried hastily in roadside ditches. Even the geography of England added to the difficulty. Much of the land was forested, with thick underbrush and few clear paths. Open plains could leave you exposed to thieves or wild animals. Mountains and moors were especially treacherous, with poor visibility and unpredictable weather. Coastal travel by ship was an option, but brought its own horrors: piracy, storms, and the general lack of swimming skills among medieval folk. When nobles traveled, it was a production. They moved with entourages, servants, guards, cooks, even carpenters to fix wagons. They brought tents, food, and armed protection. But even for them, the journey was slow, uncomfortable, and subject to the same environmental threats. Roads were often impassable, bridges collapsed, and carts broke under the weight of armor and luxuries. It could take weeks to travel distances we now cover in a few hours. Despite all of this, travel was sometimes necessary. News had to be delivered, alliances had to be forged, goods had to be traded. But no one looked forward to it. If you were a peasant, told you had to deliver a message to the next shire, your heart would sink. You'd pack dry bread, wrap your feet in rags, and pray to every saint you knew. Because once you stepped outside the familiar bounds of your village, you entered a world without mercy. There was no safety net, no helpful stranger with a phone, just you, the mud, and the long road ahead. In truth, travel in medieval England was a gamble, one where the odds were rarely in your favor. You might arrive at your destination days or weeks later, exhausted, filthy, and half-starved. Or you might never arrive at all, just another nameless soul lost to the road. So the next time you complain about traffic or delayed trains, spare a thought for the medieval traveler. At least you're not trudging through bandit country with no idea where you're going and nothing but crusty bread in your bag. In the harsh and grueling reality of medieval England, the concept of fun was radically different from today's leisure-filled lives. There were no cinemas, sports stadiums, or video games. Instead, what passed for entertainment was a strange blend of social gatherings, religious festivals, violent spectacles, and public punishments, all infused with the era's rawness, danger, and strict social order. Understanding medieval fun means stepping into a noisy, chaotic world where survival was a daily struggle, and moments of joy were fleeting, often rough, sometimes cruel, but deeply communal. The medieval fair. For most people, the closest experience to a festival or large celebration was the village or town fair, usually held once or twice a year on religious feast days or market charters granted by the king or local lord. These fairs were a crucial part of medieval life, a chance for peasants, craftsmen, and nobles alike to come together, buy and sell goods, share news, and participate in communal events. The fairs often lasted several days, filling the streets with crowds, stalls, animals, and noise. Market stalls spilled out onto muddy lanes, offering everything from fresh produce and grains to textiles, iron tools, spices if you were lucky, and livestock. The smells at fairs were a pungent mixture of roasting meat, sweat, animal manure, and sometimes the unmistakable stench of human waste, as sanitation was poor and chamber pots were often emptied into the streets. Buyers had to be sharp-eyed to avoid spoiled goods or swindlers selling fake wares. The marketplace was a rowdy, dangerous place where pickpockets and thieves thrived amid the distractions. Yet beyond trade, fairs were also social events. Jesters and minstrels performed for coins, juggling and playing lutes to entertain the crowd. Traveling players put on rough-and-ready mystery plays and morality dramas, retelling biblical stories or teaching moral lessons through simple but colorful theatrics. These performances were a rare chance for ordinary folk to see something resembling theater, even if the acting was amateurish and the scripts blunt. Public executions and punishments, entertainment for the masses. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of medieval entertainment was the popularity of public executions. Hanging, beheading, burning at the stake, and other brutal methods were not only punishments, but also events designed to serve as warnings and spectacles. Executions were held in central public spaces and attracted large crowds, sometimes numbering in the thousands. Far from being solemn occasions, executions were often rowdy and festive. Vendors sold food and drink, and spectators gossiped loudly, jeered at the condemned, and debated the fairness of the sentence. The condemned sometimes gave speeches or confessions before death, which could either elicit sympathy or scorn. The entire spectacle reinforced social order by reminding people of the consequences of crime and dissent. Other public punishments, such as the pillory or stocks, were also forms of entertainment. Offenders were locked into wooden frames in the town square and subjected to ridicule, verbal abuse, and the occasional thrown rotten vegetable or stone. The crowd's jeers and laughter served as a form of communal shaming, and these punishments were meant as deterrents, but also fulfilled a social function by uniting the community against a common wrongdoer. Animal baiting and bloody spectacles. Animal baiting was another popular pastime, especially among men and nobles. Bear baiting involved chaining a bear to a post and setting dogs on it, a savage display where the bear fought for its life amid the jeers and bets of the crowd. Bull baiting, where a bull was similarly tormented, was also common. These brutal spectacles were seen as tests of courage and strength and were often tied to gambling. There was no concept of animal welfare as understood today. The suffering of animals was merely part of the entertainment. These blood sports were intensely violent and messy, often leaving animals injured or dead, and the spectators soaked in the spectacle of pain and fear. Despite their cruelty, these events were deeply woven into medieval social life and culture, seen as rough but thrilling diversions from everyday hardship. Feasts, occasions of rarity and ritual. Feasts were a very different kind of fun. Rare moments of abundance, community, and ceremony, usually held to celebrate religious holidays, noble weddings, harvest festivals, or other major events. Feasts were occasions when food and drink overflowed far beyond the usual meager diet of peasants. The wealthy enjoyed roasted meats like beef, pork, lamb, venison, and game birds, accompanied by rich pies, breads, and imported spices. Banquets for lords could be lavish, with multiple courses and entertainment such as minstrels, jesters, and dancing. The social hierarchy was strictly observed. Lords and ladies sat on high benches while peasants ate on the floor or outdoors. Feasts reinforced social bonds and status, but also provided a rare chance for the community to celebrate and relax. For peasants, feasts were simpler but still welcomed breaks from the daily grind. Porridges, stews, and occasional meat or fish, if they were lucky, were shared. Drinking ale or mead was central to feasts. fueling singing, storytelling, and dancing. Although joyous, feasts were still framed by religious observance, with prayers before meals and a strong emphasis on charity and humility. Drinking, dancing, and disorder. Alehouses and taverns were the social hubs of medieval villages and towns, places where adults gathered to drink, socialize, and sometimes gamble. Drinking contests were common, and heavy drinking often led to loud arguments or fights. While taverns were centers of community life, they were also sources of social tension and disorder, prompting authorities to regulate their hours and behavior. Dancing and music were also important outlets for expression and joy. Folk dances, accompanied by fiddles, flutes, and drums, brought communities together. Seasonal dances at harvest or religious festivals combined merriment with ritual, helping to mark time and community identity. Children's play, brief and practical. For children, fun was limited and practical. Toys such as wooden swords, rag dolls, or balls were handmade and simple. Most children were expected to work early, either helping with chores, farming, or learning trades. Their play mirrored adult life, often rough, physical, and short-lived, as survival took priority over leisure. The smell, noise, and chaos of medieval fun. The sensory experience of medieval entertainment was intense. The air was filled with competing sounds, shouting merchants, bawling animals, music, laughter, and screams from executions or fights. The streets were muddy, littered with refuse and filth, and reeked of sweat, smoke, and waste. Crowds jostled and surged in a chaotic dance that could quickly turn violent. Despite this harshness, these communal gatherings served important social and psychological functions. They provided breaks from backbreaking labor and isolation, reinforced social order, transmitted cultural values, and forged a shared identity. The line between entertainment and punishment, between joy and cruelty, was thin, reflecting the precariousness and brutality of medieval life itself. Let me know if you'd like to continue with the next segment or need edits to this one. Witches, goblins, and moonlight fear. Superstition rules all. In medieval England, the unseen world, filled with witches, goblins, curses, and magic, was not just a tale told around fires. It was a living, breathing reality that influenced every aspect of daily life. From the poorest peasant in a remote village to the highest noble in a stone castle, superstition and fear of supernatural forces governed thoughts, actions, and survival strategies. The medieval mind was enveloped in a constant battle with invisible forces, where good and evil spirits lurked everywhere, and a slip into darkness could mean ruin or death. The landscape of fear. Medieval England's landscape seemed to breathe with superstition. Dense, dark forests were not just home to wild animals, but also to goblins, fairies, and other mysterious creatures believed to be capricious or malevolent. Villagers avoided certain woods after dusk, fearing that to wander too far was to invite curses or get lost forever in enchanted realms. Many people believed that the very shadows held spirits that could snatch children or cause illness. A full moon, an eclipse, or strange weather was a sign that otherworldly powers were at work. Homes were protected with charms. Sprigs of herbs like rosemary or sage hung above doors, crosses carved into beams, or salt sprinkled on thresholds. Failure to take these precautions was often blamed for sickness or misfortune. Mothers warned their children about the night hags or old crones who would steal souls in sleep, and midwives carried protective amulets when delivering babies. The ever-present dread of supernatural harm was a constant companion. Witches, women of power and fear. Among all supernatural fears, the dread of witches was perhaps the most potent and dangerous. Unlike today's more romanticized view of witches, medieval witches were viewed as agents of the devil, witches who traded their souls for dark powers and used magic to harm their neighbors. Witchcraft was linked to heresy, a crime punishable by death, and accusations could arise from jealousy, unexplained misfortune, or mere suspicion. Most accused witches were older women, often widows or outcasts who lived alone and practiced herbal medicine or midwifery. Their knowledge of plants and healing, combined with their marginal social status, made them targets. If a crop failed, a child fell ill, or a cow died unexpectedly, fingers pointed at the local wise woman, accusing her of casting a curse. Trials for witchcraft could be brutal and unfair, relying on hearsay and superstition rather than evidence. The church condemned witchcraft vigorously, preaching sermons about the devil's temptations and the dangers of sorcery. Clergy might exorcise houses or people, using holy water and prayers to cleanse evil spirits, but their authority did not always protect accused witches from vigilante violence. Public executions by hanging or burning served both to punish and to frighten communities into submission. Guide goblin lore and folk beliefs. Medieval folklore teemed with stories of goblins, brownies, and other small mischievous creatures. These beings were blamed for all manner of minor household mischief: lost keys, spilled milk, broken tools. Brownies were sometimes considered helpful spirits who tidied homes at night in exchange for small gifts of food, but goblins were more often troublesome, leading travelers astray or stealing crops. Superstitions around these creatures influenced everyday behavior. Children were warned not to talk to strangers or wander alone, lest goblins whisk them away. Travelers carried protective talismans or recited prayers to keep evil at bay. Even the timing of daily tasks was influenced by superstition. Certain days or times were considered unlucky for planting or travel, guided by omens and celestial movements. Magic and curses, the invisible weapons. Magic was seen as a powerful, invisible force that could shape reality in ways no one fully understood. The belief in curses and blessings was widespread. A curse could be as simple as an angry neighbor's spite or as elaborate as a ritual conducted by a witch. Villagers might curse someone by uttering a hex, spitting over their shoulder, or casting a black cat's shadow. Curses were blamed for sudden illness, infertility, or bad harvests, and many lived in fear that they had unknowingly offended a witch or a spirit. Conversely, blessings and charms were sought to protect against these evils. Holy relics, saints' medals, prayers, and pilgrimages were believed to have protective power. People would carry amulets or inscribe crosses on their homes and livestock. The church's rituals of confession, mass, and sacraments were believed to shield souls from the devil's reach, but many folk customs blended Christian and pagan practices in an uneasy mixture of beliefs. The role of the church and clergy. The medieval church played a paradoxical role in this world of superstition. On one hand, it sought to eradicate pagan beliefs and superstition, condemning witches, diviners, and heretics as servants of Satan. On the other hand, the church's own rituals, relics, and saints' legends fed a mystical atmosphere, offering solace, but also fear. Priests were often the only literate figures in a village, seen as intermediaries between the divine and human realms. They conducted exorcisms, blessed crops and animals, and led prayers against evil. Yet they too were vulnerable to superstition. Tales of priests wielding holy power clashed with rumors of some practicing forbidden magic in secret. The boundaries between religion, superstition, and fear were blurry, and the church was both a source of comfort and a pillar of control. Fear of the unknown, how it shaped society. This pervasive fear of unseen forces shaped behavior in profound ways. People avoided actions that might attract evil spirits or curses. Pregnant women wore protective charms. Sick individuals sought prayers or herbal remedies. Farmers observed omens in weather and animal behavior. This constant vigilance affected daily routines and social relations. Communities enforced strict moral codes, believing that sin invited the devil's influence. Witch trials, often fueled by panic and scapegoating, could tear apart families and villages. The fear of curses and magic meant that even simple illnesses or accidents were attributed to malevolent forces rather than natural causes. Superstition as a means of control. Superstition also functioned as a means of social control. Lords and church officials used fear of divine punishment and witchcraft to maintain order. Accusations of witchcraft could eliminate troublesome individuals or outsiders. Preachers emphasized the consequences of sin and the devil's power to keep people obedient and fearful. At the same time, folk beliefs allowed peasants to make sense of a harsh world where natural explanations were scarce. Superstition provided explanations for random suffering and hope for protection, blending fear with resilience. You can't read this. Literacy was for the few. In medieval England, the written word was a rare and precious commodity, accessible only to a tiny fraction of the population. Unlike today, where literacy is considered fundamental and widespread, most medieval people, peasants, townsfolk, and even many nobles, could neither read nor write. The ability to read was not a universal skill, but a luxury tightly bound to social class, occupation, and gender. Books were scarce, expensive, and laboriously hand-copied by scribes, and schools were few and far between. This profound illiteracy shaped society in profound ways, influencing power structures, communication, and culture. The cost and rarity of books. To grasp why literacy was so limited, one must understand the nature of books in the medieval period. Before the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, every book was painstakingly copied by hand. Monks in monasteries spent hours, days, and sometimes months producing single manuscripts on parchment made from animal skins. Each page was inked with painstaking calligraphy, often decorated with colorful illustrations and gold leaf. This process made books extremely expensive. A single Bible or religious text could cost more than a year's wages for a typical laborer. As a result, books were treasures, typically owned only by monasteries, cathedrals, universities, and the wealthiest nobles. The common people had little access to written materials because owning a book was simply out of reach financially. Who could read and write? Literacy was almost exclusively the province of the clergy and some of the nobility. Monks, priests, and other religious officials were educated to read Latin, the language of the church and scholarship, but many could not read English or the vernacular languages spoken by ordinary people. The church was the main institution responsible for education and literacy, and it saw reading primarily as a tool to understand and teach scripture. Among the nobility, literacy was uneven. Some lords and ladies learned to read and write, especially in French or Latin, which were the languages of law, diplomacy, and literature at the time. However, many nobles relied on clerks and scribes to manage their estates, write letters, and record accounts. For common folk, literacy was practically non-existent. Peasants and laborers were overwhelmingly illiterate, spending their lives on manual work and oral tradition. Schools, who went and what was taught. Formal education was limited and focused largely on preparing clerics or administrators rather than the general population. Cathedral schools, monastic schools, and later some universities offered instruction mostly to boys from privileged families. The curriculum centered on Latin grammar, religious studies, and rhetoric, skills needed for church service or legal work. For the average child in a village, schooling was a foreign concept. Most learned trades and skills through hands-on work from parents or apprenticeships. Girls especially had little access to formal education. Their learning centered on household skills, childcare, and sometimes needlework. Literacy was simply not expected or encouraged among commoners. Because most people could not read or write, medieval England was a predominantly oral culture. Stories, history, laws, and news were passed down by word of mouth. Traveling storytellers, bards, and minstrels played a vital role in sharing tales of heroes, legends, and religious teachings. Village elders and church priests often recited sermons and parables to educate the masses. This reliance on oral tradition shaped how knowledge was preserved and transmitted. Memory and repetition were key, and many stories were embellished or altered over time. The spoken word was alive, immediate, and communal, but also vulnerable to loss or distortion without the permanence of writing. The impact on law and administration. The scarcity of literacy had significant effects on law and governance. Legal records, property deeds, and official documents were maintained by clerks or scribes, often monks or educated laymen who were trusted to keep accurate accounts. Common people rarely had direct access to these documents or the ability to read legal texts. This dependency on intermediaries created opportunities for abuse and misunderstanding. Peasants might not fully grasp the terms of agreements or the scope of their obligations, relying instead on oral explanations that could be misleading. Lords and officials held much of the power because they controlled the written record. The complexity of legal language in Latin further isolated ordinary people from fully participating in governance. Religious life and literacy. Religion was central to medieval life, and the church used literacy both as a tool and a barrier. The Bible and most religious texts were written in Latin, inaccessible to the lay population. To bridge this gap, clergy read scriptures aloud during Mass, and sermons explain religious teachings. Some translations of the Bible into Old or Middle English existed, but were rare and often controversial. The church worried that reading scripture without clerical guidance might lead to heresy or misinterpretation. Literacy among laypeople in religious matters was limited by design, reinforcing the clergy's authority as spiritual guides. The rise of vernacular literature. Toward the late medieval period, vernacular languages, English, French, and others, began to appear more frequently in literature, law, and official documents. Poets like Geoffrey Chaucer wrote in Middle English, making literature more accessible to those who could read their native tongue. The spread of vernacular writing slowly expanded literacy beyond clergy and nobles. Towns grew, and with them, a class of merchants, artisans, and officials who needed basic reading and writing skills for business. However, even by the late 1400s, literacy remained limited compared to modern standards. Women and literacy. Literacy for women was even rarer than for men. Noble women sometimes received education, often through private tutors or convent schools, learning to read and write to manage households and estates or for religious devotion. However, most women, especially peasants, remained illiterate throughout their lives. The lack of literacy restricted women's ability to participate fully in social, economic, and religious life. It also reinforced gender roles, with men dominating the domains of law, scholarship, and public administration. The printing press in the future. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century began to change the landscape of literacy, but its impact was gradual. Early printed books were still expensive, and literacy spread slowly over the next centuries. In medieval England, however, literacy remained a rare and privileged skill, closely tied to power, religion, and social status. Summary: a world without reading. To imagine medieval England is to picture a world where most voices went unheard in written form, where communication depended heavily on oral traditions, and where knowledge was a guarded treasure. Illiteracy was not merely a lack of skill, but a defining feature of social hierarchy. The vast majority of people lived their lives cut off from the permanence and authority of the written word, navigating a complex world shaped by spoken laws, oral histories, and a deep trust in those who could read. This widespread illiteracy reinforced existing power structures, made religion a central pillar of daily existence, and kept knowledge confined to a select few. The medieval era's struggle with literacy reveals much about its society's nature: unequal, hierarchical, and deeply intertwined with faith and tradition. Life in medieval England was brutally harsh, so much so that surviving even a single day was a monumental challenge. From the moment people woke up in cramped, smoky huts shared with animals, they faced a world of relentless hardship. Food was scarce and often spoiled, clean water was rare, and disease ran rampant without any effective medicine. Labor was backbreaking, and children were expected to work from a very young age. Serfs were legally bound to their lords with no freedom to leave or own land, while violence, famine, and natural disasters lurked constantly. Justice was terrifyingly brutal, and superstition ruled minds, adding psychological burdens to the physical ones. Life expectancy was low, and most never reached old age. Given these overwhelming difficulties, it's clear that medieval survival was a daily battle against near impossible odds. What do you think? How would you cope if you were forced to live in such a harsh world? Could you endure the endless toil, fear, and uncertainty? Feel free to share your thoughts or ask questions in the comments below.